Okay, so it's a good afternoon from me. It's just gone 12:40 in the afternoon here in the UK. Obviously, in other parts of the world, it's still morning. Other parts of the world, it's later in the afternoon. In some parts of the world, it's nighttime. But I want to say a massive hello to everyone. Obviously, we've had a lot of new subscribers in the last week or so. So, for those who are newer subscribers who'll be tuning in for the first time, please be aware you have to be a subscriber, obviously, to leave comments in the chat section and questions for me to answer. And obviously, the rest is self-explanatory. Obviously, if you obviously see someone with that blue spanner icon, they are my moderators. Please treat them with respect as well, because obviously they keep everything neat and tidy in the comments section. And give me a helping hand, and just get the questions in and enjoy. So lots to discuss. Obviously, the Rugby World Cup is obviously dominating sports news at the moment because it is the big thing to discuss. Refereeing obviously has been very controversial so far in the tournament, and obviously some of the new rules that World Rugby have brought in for this tournament and going forward, especially with the TMO review for yellow and red cards upgrading and downgrading. Um, Big talking point there with consistency and some of the missed calls that we have seen. And that's very obvious, and of course we can discuss that to death. I mean, have World Rugby been far too reactionary in regards to some of their rule changes? I would say yes. I would say player welfare is a priority, obviously, but I would say more proactive rules surrounding head contact and HIAs and mandatory stand down periods, I think, is the way to go over, let's say, more reactionary sin binnings and red cards for accidental head contact. Because if we're going to go down that route, we'll end up with no players on the field. Quite honestly, we will end up basically playing sevens and touch rugby sevens, and we don't want that. I think rugby league as the rival code, I think have got to be more proactive in engaging with neurosurgeons and science and doctors and obviously physios in regards to making sure the players are looked after. And again, there's still issues with the rules that rugby league have brought in across the professional game in the NRL and Super League in regards to how long should a stand down period be, how long should a um, how the grading works, what constitutes an automatic HIA protocol. But I think they're going in a better direction. I think rugby union have been very reactionary because of recent interviews and statements given by some ex-players who've had some medical diagnosis and are having health issues. And obviously, we've seen some very tragic. We've had some very tragic news, obviously, from both codes of rugby in regards to CTE and unfortunately, several ex-players and coaches are no longer with us. I think Paul Green from last year is the prime example in that case from rugby league. Obviously, with a very bad case of CT, and obviously he did take his own life last year, and it stunned the rugby league world at least, and I think it also stunned the sporting world, not just in Australia, but I think around the world. If you are a hardcore sports fan and you keep up to date with these things, and you follow sport globally, that was a stunning you know, short spell of time between him obviously being sacked as Queensland head coach and being offered a potential assistant coaching role back in the NRL, and then with his tragic passing. We've had obviously some other high-profile players in several sports have potential early diagnosis of CTE because the science again evolved on a regular week-to-week basis. More information is discovered by scientists and researchers, and for those who deny that repeat concussions cause it, it makes no sense to me. But I do think we're not going to get head contact out of ice hockey or rugby union or rugby league or American football. We have to mitigate the risk in a certain sense of rushing players back into play when they're clearly not fit. I think we need to look at the HIA protocols and go, even if a player passes, they cannot return to play that game, but they are eligible for the next game as long as they meet certain protocols within a period of time, because delayed concussion is a thing. I speak from experience. And if a player fails, I think they fails an HIA, I think we have to look at it and go, okay, maybe this player needs a lengthier time to recover. I think at the moment, I don't think the HIA protocols or the concussion protocols, depending on the sport and the circumstance, are strong enough. I think there's also we need to get more independent doctors and physios in rather than team doctors to assess these players, because obviously a coach wants to see his best player on the field or on the ice or on the court or wherever, whatever sport we're talking about. Obviously, the coaches want their best players out there participating. I know in boxing, if you get knocked out, I think it's a mandatory 3-month stand down from your next fight. If you are deemed to have had a concussive episode, so that's either in training or actually in the ring in a professional bout, there is a minimum mandatory non-fight stand down, and within that period of time, you have to meet certain protocols. That's one of the few things boxing actually gets right in regards to its athletes' welfare. There's lots of things boxing gets wrong, but that's, I think, one of the areas where boxing takes the lead and has realised quite early on, well, we spend our entire careers bashing each other in the head for a living. We might want to look after our welfare a little bit, but you look at the issues with retired boxers with their health issues, and it's Muhammad Ali and George Foreman and fighting Joe Fraser and Henry Cooper and some of these other great fighters from the 60s and 70s. You look at them, obviously a few of them are no longer with us, and their mental and physical deterioration was very, very obvious by the end, especially with Muhammad Ali. It was heartbreaking to watch him. So that's something of consideration. Obviously, the quality of play we've seen in the Rugby World Cup has been, I would say, pretty good. There's only been a handful of games that I would go weren't great. Both England games were not on the highest quality for different reasons. Um, I think both Wales games as well, you could argue Wales weren't quite at the races. Scrappy wins, but they're wins. Obviously, Australia losing to Fiji is I think, the big story to come out of this weekend. And Uruguay nearly beating France is another big story to come out of this weekend's matches in the Rugby World Cup. The Fiji Australia one, I'm surprised isn't getting more coverage in regards to in the rugby union world, especially to casual fans who'd be like, well, what's going on here? Hardcore fans will realise this Fijian team is world class. There's a reason why they're ranked so highly, and there's a reason why they have now got to the level that they're at. This Australian setup is a shambles, and if you are an Australian rugby union fan, I mean, Australian fans have been saying for years that the game is in a poor state down under. And I would easily agree with any Australian rugby union fan or just sports fan in general that the Wallabies is not the terrifying force that they were in the 90s, well, the late 80s through the 90s into the early to mid 2000s. They're not at the level that they were at when they were winning World Cups and playing in World Cup finals and on the regular. They have massively declined over the last 10. I mean, they've been in the World Cup final in the last decade, but they've massively declined as a sporting unit and as on a sporting level. And then you have to look at, as I mentioned in the match review, they're paying these really big contracts to lure rugby league players, be it Australian rugby league players who are eligible, or Pacific Island players over to rugby union. Big contracts. Whilst instead of investing that money into the existing clubs and the grassroots game and the community game and the domestic club game in Australia below Super Rugby, they're paying these mercenary players. And I've got nothing against the players who obviously want to get paid and make sure that their careers are profitable, because they're short and obviously they want to look after themselves and their families post retirement. But it's not solving the issues of youth development, player development, and the pathways, which desperately need investment. And I think you can go back pre-Israel Folau for a lot of these issues. They did it in the build up to the 2003 World Cup. They brought over Rogers, Saylor, Takiri, big name rugby league players who won everything in rugby league. They offered these big contracts, and Wendell Saylor's a fantastic player. Lotte Takiri was a fantastic player. Rogers was a fantastic player. Not having a go at them, they were great dual code internationals. They played both forms of rugby. They were great players, great ambassadors for the game, on the field at least. Off the field, you could argue Wendell Saylor was a bit of a plonker, but at times. are badly advised, but they were great ambassadors on the field. For their skill and their power and their ability. Great, you know, you know, um, great inspirations on the field, and that's where the slippery slope really starts. You could argue Campese, but that's when they're doing it en masse. They get to a World Cup final with these players at home in Australia in 2003. They get to a final. Obviously, they ultimately end up losing to England, famously with that Johnny Wilson drop goal, 20 years ago. But they get to a World Cup final with some of these rugby league talented players coming into their system. Um, and it's been a repeating current trend since the early 2000s of basically paying rugby league players from the NRL big centralised contracts to come over to rugby union, and it has not worked. It's costing them more money than the game makes. They've had the Israel Folau scandal. I think that's the best way. Episode's a better way to describe it, which ultimately cost them a lot of money out in an outcourt settlement. Obviously, the original Super Rugby format collapsed partly because of COVID, which cost the game a lot of money, and they lost a lot of sponsors. And there was a lot of turmoil at the head, in the structures of the game at the governance level, and rugby union is losing talent at youth level to rugby league and AFL, and then at senior level, a lot of younger players are going over to Europe or Major League Rugby because they can get paid more. And a lot of them have a parent or a grandparent from a European nation that they are eligible for, and or they get residency because they've been in that country long enough to gain residency, and they ultimately end up playing for another country. And that talent pool is lost to the Wallabies. So, and I've got a lot of Australian viewers, and I think the debate about the state of rugby union in Australia is going to be a big one. So there's that. But ultimately, looking at the World Cup, they've made some changes this weekend for the anthems, they should have started with the anthems like that. There has now been a discussion in commentary about this new Gilbert World Cup ball that is slightly different to the normal Gilbert ball. I do believe from this year onwards, Gilbert have adjusted the ball mechanics a little bit, how it's put together, its weight, the grip bubbles on it, a very slight change in shape. It kicks a bit further. Apparently, it's a little bit lighter, and because it needs to be kicked in, if that makes sense, hit in like a cricket bat, and that will wear off the grip on the outside of the ball, which could explain why we are seeing a lot of handling errors. So there is a debate about the science and the manufacture of this current Gilbert ball that is being used at this World Cup. It does differ from a standard Gilbert ball slightly. I think it wasn't just my eyes playing tricks on me. It does rotate slightly differently in the air when passed or kicked. It does bounce slightly differently from the old ball. So we'll see if it's just a one-off for the World Cup and they've just adjusted the design of the ball for the World Cup, or if it's going to be a long-term design change to encourage more attacking kicking rather than the kick tennis, and change how the ball handles and passes to actually really test the players a little bit more. We'll see if World Rugby have actually given a directive to Gilbert, or Gilbert have come to World Rugby and said, look, we've come up with this slightly altered design from the traditional. It may add a little bit more jeopardy to the game because it's going to behave differently, and therefore the game will become more open because there's more spill. Pass may not go to hand because it's rotating differently. The kick may rotate differently if you've got a spiral bomb going up, which is more of a rugby league AFL kicking technique. But because of the crossover of athletic talent and coaching, that may have an impact. It may be harder to catch, so there's going to be a defensive mistake, and then the attacking player and the kicking team can pick up all that kind of thing. There's definitely been some coordination between World Rugby and Gilbert over ball manufacturing. As I've said, I prefer kicking a rugby league ball and an AFL ball, or even an AFL ball because it's designed for kicking, obviously, than a rugby union ball. You can get much more spin on a rugby league ball or an AFL ball in regards to how it rotates after it leaves the foot and how it travels. Although it is harder to spin pass a rugby league ball, it's easier to kick. AFL, you obviously pass it by punching it out of your hand like that, so that again rotates differently. Do I think the Warriors? Well, they put in a very solid performance against the Newcastle Knights, didn't they? Obviously, I haven't watched much of the finals because of the Rugby World Cup. I've watched a handful of the women's end of season games. I haven't watched many of the finals matches. I probably will watch the grand final, however. I think they've got a very good chance. I know going into the postseason, Metcalf was an injury concern with a hammy, and of course, um, Johnson obviously had his injury concern for game one, but you put them into the side and they're completely different. I think they're crucial if they can not only make the grand final but win the grand final. I think they're an outside bet. Look at the positivity that they've established in New Zealand, which is vital. And of course, over the next year or so, we're going to be having a discussion about where the 18th NRL team gets placed because there's going to be an expansion. We know this. You can't have an odd team, an odd numbered league for teams for too long. So there's going to be an 18th team by at least 2025, so in the next 2 years. And a second team in New Zealand is gaining further momentum and traction as a potential. So you look at how good the crowds have been, ticket sales. You look at the responses on social media, the engagement, especially when they take games on the road, as in the Warriors, and also other clubs when they take a home game to somewhere in New Zealand. Crowd numbers are always really, really good. And so there is a high chance that a New Zealand bid for a second team, be it on North or South Island, you could argue Auckland maybe keep it one team in Auckland, maybe one team in Wellington, or Christchurch. But we'll see. I think Perth has a strong argument and a strong case. Adelaide has a weaker case. Geographically has a stronger case. But we'll see. We'll see what transpires. There's multiple options that could and should be considered. Central Coast has a very good case as well. That's obviously in New South Wales. Obviously, the game is very New South Wales centric, the NRL, but the AFL is very state of Victoria centric. So we've had the same debate in the AFL about where they expand, and is the Tasmania expansion going to go ahead, or relocation going to go ahead? And there's been a lot of positive and negative debate surrounding that, and controversy surrounding that potential outcome. But at the end of the day, nothing's been set in stone. Obviously, before we get to the ultimate expansion, whenever that may be in 2025 or 2026, the games in Vegas first get played. Now, it's going to be interesting to see the response. I've now seen adverts for tickets for the Vegas games, so they're now already promoting ticket sales, and we've got 7 months until about 7 months actually until the games take place. So they're already advertising tickets and merchandise. Whether they're also advertising that to the US domestic audience is going to be interesting. I saw it on what women's NRLW match was I? I was watching the Parramatta Cronulla women's NRLW game, and in the midway through the first half, they were advertising tickets and merchandise sales mid broadcast. So that's going to be interesting to see the response. Well, look, if you've got a state government that's got a cash surplus for infrastructure, and you've got regional government backing, that's going to obviously go a long way. They obviously see the economic benefits of having a big pro sports team in the city of Perth. Yes, you've got two AFL teams and an A League team there as well, and of course you've got the Big Bash cricket and then the Sheffield Shield. Is it Sheffield Shield or Shield cricket? I think it's Sheffield Shield cricket. So you've got some professional sport at a high level already there. They've got decent stadium infrastructure already. State of Origin goes there already, and then you've got to look at the economic benefits to that. because obviously Western Australia, much like many countries on their own, its economy is more heavily reliant on natural resource extraction than manufacturing or agriculture. And of course, Perth is quite isolated from and the Perth metro region, which is 75% of Western Australia's population live in Perth. All the surrounding areas are probably in a 200-mile or 100-mile radius or kilometre radius of the centre of Perth. So it's a very heavy population centric around the Perth area. Yes, they do. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the Western world, as we would say it. Perth is rapidly expanding, but the economy is very, very resource extraction reliant, and so getting a sports team there, ironically, get that tourism impact and leisure industry impact, the tertiary sector, which can generate a lot of income. So while this is a sports channel, there is that political element. I've got to rest my back up. My back is really playing me up at the moment, so it's going to be a little bit weird, but I'm going to have to lie down. Well, when I say lie down, I'm just going to prop my back up on the bed. Yeah, so the fact that you've got a lot of overseas expats, and it's not just Kiwi and Brits, because it's not just England. You've got a lot of people from Scotland, Ireland, Wales, which is why rugby union does really well in Perth. And what we call football, what obviously they call soccer, does reasonably well in Perth as well. So, but at the same time, it is a rapidly growing city. The cost of living in Western Australia is generally, historically, higher than the national average in Australia because of the isolation of the main population areas, which is the Perth and then the surrounding towns and cities and local government areas within a certain radius. The Kimberley and obviously the northern part you have got reasonable population centres, but they're not massive, and they're all quite isolated from each other. And of course, then you've got the massive desert wilderness and the outback wilderness where all the resources are, all the mines and oil wells and gas wells and stuff, quarries. But no, Western Australia, as I say, the cost of living generally on average is higher because of the geographical isolation. But property prices are cheaper because there's so much more space in Western Australia to build a home, build a business. So land prices, ironically, are cheaper, which actually impacts the average cost of living. Is it KPI CPI index? I forget the index they use. So people actually, ironically, have more cash in their pocket in Western Australia per average for the average salary than in New South Wales, Queensland, or Victoria. So people's money goes further. Yes, there have been a lot of relocations. A lot of them are engineers, so they're on reasonable incomes. A lot of them are in the finance sector, so they've got reasonable incomes, and they've relocated for work. They haven't relocated for retirement. They have relocated for work. These are the people with the middle to higher income brackets, so they've got money to spend. Because they've either got a skilled trade, and we're talking really skilled, we're talking not really working class wage bracket, we're talking engineer level, degree level kind of education here, and we're talking engineering, where we're coming up with big mining equipment ideas to work. We're talking actual higher level heavy industry jobs, and then you've got the tech sector. The Western Australian government wants to diversify their economy, so you want to attract people in. Same with Vegas. It is exactly the same with Vegas, wanting to diversify their economy away from tourism, solely tourism and gambling, and those industries, to a wider economic base. And with that, you have these high-paying, high-tech jobs, which bring money into the economy. And then, as a result of that, you've got more disposable income, and a sports team or teams can be very, very profitable. So look at the Vegas Golden Knights, look at the Raiders, which obviously are a relocation, and look what the major leagues in North America are doing with Las Vegas. It is an economic gravy train. And the state of Nevada also has backed a lot of these uh, professional sports team bids to have a team, and then the tourism board, which is linked to the state of Nevada, obviously the actual government side of it, gets some funding, really driving like the MGM resorts, for example, and the tourism adverts like Visit Nevada and all that. When you watch Major League North American sport, a lot of that sponsorship, big casinos are now obviously because the relaxation of gambling, sports gambling laws in the US has now meant that the casino operators in Reno and Vegas and Carson City in Nevada can now reach a wider online audience and grow their business model. Plus, the overseas gambling companies, which mostly are British, by the way, or Australian, have now set up their US arms and also their Canadian arms as well, and they are sponsoring the major leagues. And we're having that debate about gambling sponsorship in sport, and should we try and reduce the, the, the amount of sponsorship and find less vice. Basically, we've had the same debate with alcohol and tobacco. We still do have alcohol sponsorship, but not on the level we did, and that's because the breweries and the wine manufacturers and distilleries that make the spirits have got their own economic issues, which I'm going to discuss on another video on the other channel. Really, I came up with a video idea about the state of the um, licensed premises. So it's not just pubs, it's bars, it's nightclubs, and how many close down per week and per day. I think it's 2 pubs per day in the UK are shutting down on an average at the moment. So that's 14 a week. You times that by 14 a week by 52, and there's that's how many licensed pubs are going out of business. That's not including nightclubs, bars, strip clubs, anything that has a license attached to it going out of business. It's ridiculous, and so that's having a knock-on impact on the alcohol brewers and distillers and wineries that sell their, and even soft drink manufacturers that sell their products to licensed premises. They're losing money. It's actually hurting the brewing industry. It's hurting the drinks industry, and it's not good. It's not a good time to be in the bar and pub trade. Um, but yeah, no, it is interesting when you look at the social makeup and the economic makeup of where you place a sports franchise, or how you can make your sports team reach a wider audience. So when we're talking about rugby league here in the UK and the potential which could stop like what teams like the Batley Bulldogs or Featherstone Rovers or whoever it may be from entering the Super League because they don't meet certain requirements. Well, they're never going to meet those certain requirements because they're not getting the exposure that they need to grow their fan base outside of the local area. Because the Lee Leopards, formerly Lee Centurions, have a small fan base. They just won the Challenge Cup, so it's a bit of hypocrisy if Lee Leopards are allowed to stay in the Super League, but Batley Bulldogs can't. That to me is wrong. We've had bad news about the London Scholars over the weekend. They're now having to pull out of League One because they just can't sustain themselves at that level. And it's not for not wanting to remain in the professional and semi-pro ranks. They're having to go back to the amateur side of the game. London Broncos have gone to part-time status. So when we're talking about, we obviously hosted a World Cup last year and talking about a legacy and growing the game. Well, the game's going the other way, and the quality level between European rugby league and what we do see in Australia and New Zealand, the gap's there. You see it in the women's game, you're seeing it in the men's game. It's so obvious. The speed of the game is better, the skill level is better, and the physicality is a massive difference. Fitness, it is very noticeable with the NRL over the Super League. Okay, St Helens beat Penrith, but the weather conditions had a massive impact on that game playing out the way it did. But And look how many Super League sides have actually defeated an NRL side in the World Club Challenge since 1998. Oh, how big the Western Reds were. Well, look, back in 20 odd years ago, there wasn't the money. There wasn't the money in rugby league because of the Super League war and how much the litigation actually cost. Um, there and the financial impacts that the game found itself in, the financial mess the game found itself in because of this unnecessary mess made by Murdoch and Packer, basically the media barons. Um, the game was not in a financially good place, and there's still repercussions being felt all these years later, um, following the Super League wars, or however you want to, the Super League experiment. Um, there's still financial issues within the game that are still, being worked out. That's why we have dual venture clubs, and we can argue the pros and cons and the success of West Tigers and St George Illawarra. Um, kicking South out the competition for a couple of years. The Northern Eagles, so the Northern Bears get forced to screwed over. We can argue the pros and cons of those decisions back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But the financial impacts are still being felt. The community impacts are still being felt. So, the Super League war, going back decades after the game, was probably number. Look, at Super League here in the UK, it hasn't given the benefits that were meant to have come to the game. The TV deal now is really not a great deal. The quality of the game and the finances of the game are in crisis. When you have two teams, one team having to go to amateur status and one team basically becoming semi-pro after only being in the Super League a couple of years ago, it tells you all you need to know. And and just because they're in the south of England, in the London area, don't the game is not growing outside of the traditional locations. France is the exception with Toulouse and Catalan. Obviously, Toulouse didn't have the best season in Super League, but the London Broncos have been to a Challenge Cup final, and I think they've been in the Super League playoffs as well in their history. But the issues are there that you look at the area in which these teams play. Only a handful of locations is the economy doing well. You could argue Leeds is one of the biggest economies in the UK, big financial centre. Leeds is a big city. Obviously, Greater Manchester, you've got a fair few teams in Greater Manchester, and Greater Manchester is another big economic hub of the country, but does have huge areas of deprivation. You could say that about London with football and rugby union as well. And just look at a couple of the clubs that went bust were London based. Well, Wasps obviously decided to move out of London, go to Coventry, which was already causing them problems long before COVID, but London Irish. So but for the most part, you're looking at areas that aren't economically doing very well, where the populations have low incomes, high unemployment, lack of investment. We can talk about the jobs market and the economy, and therefore disposable income for fans. So how much money fans are going to be able to be spending and contributing to their clubs, which then limits how the economic viability or growth. And then you look at the much wider UK economy; it's not doing great right now. And then, yeah, rugby league is badly governed, if I'm honest. Now the NRL does do it better, but there's so many issues with the game's governance. It's a recurring theme every decade. It's a recurring theme of poor governance, weak governance, instability in governance, and that's where you end up with the Super League war and the changing of rugby league in the Northern Hemisphere from a winter sport to a summer sport, and I think that's disengaged a lot of fans, because you can't school year play your rugby in the winter, Easter terms, not summer term. That's cricket, and cricket's big up north in England as well. Yorkshire and Lancashire are two of the most successful counties and County Durham are three of the most successful counties in the county game, in the county championship structure. So you, you automatically, traditionalists don't like it. When you talk about school, and the age grade teams, um, would you rather play on a soft, muddy pitch or a hot, rock hard pitch in summer where there's not enough rainfall in it and your skin's being ripped off with like basically road rash? I would much prefer the old mud bath over the rock hard, nearly concrete. Let's look at last summer, for example, with the heat we had last year and that excessive heat wave. It was ridiculous. Um, yeah. A lot of the areas. We have some wealthy areas up north. There's some very wealthy cities. York and Leeds, for example, are in national terms are quite wealthy compared, especially in regional terms. Leeds is a very wealthy city compared to Bradford, which is right next door. Bradford is a lot less, similar population size for both cities, but Bradford doesn't do as well economically. And look at the state of Leeds Rhinos versus the Bradford Bullets, and the complete difference in how those teams are doing. You look at Leeds United versus Bradford City and Bradford Park Avenue. Look at the divisions they're in and where they're at, and yeah. But then you look at Greater Manchester, and it's not just you've got within Greater Manchester, which is mostly part of Lancashire, although I've been in Cheshire is part of historically Cheshire's in it. And it's a very Greater Manchester is a very congested sports market. You've got a lot of football clubs, a lot of rugby league clubs, and of course you've got Sale as the top rugby union club in there as well. Plus, then you've got the county cricket club. Plus, you've got the Manchester Storm ice hockey team in the Elite League. It's a very congested sports market, much like London. London's a very congested sports market. It amazes me that London as a sports catchment area, and then of course you've got to include the whole of the southeast, which is roughly, is it a third of the nation? The whole of the UK's population lives within 2.5 hours of London, or something like that, or within a certain 60, 70 mile. It's ridiculous. If you do there's the city of Westminster, Palace of Westminster. You do a massive circle. That's where the majority of the UK's population lives. It's either in the West Midlands, Greater Manchester in the northwest, Glasgow, and Greater London. That's bang, there you go. And it's basically in a straight line down. Weird. It does amaze me, however, that in that congested sports market, you look at my football club histories, but I'm just looking at the professional clubs in the football pyramid. I've still got Harrow Wealdstone to look at. There's Yeading United. Is it Yeading United? There's a fair few non-league clubs, but basically are professional in all but name. It is amazing. I looked at the Wide World of Stadiums YouTube channel, and they did a video on all the stadiums and arenas with a capacity of over 4,000. It was ridiculous how many are in Greater London. Absolutely ridiculous. It'll be interesting to see how many are in, let's say, Greater Manchester. Maybe not as many, but it's still a ridiculous number. So it does amaze me that they're able to basically have their own football league, and traditionally, rugby union, they could have had their own rugby premiership with the amount of clubs that are in London. Absolutely ridiculous, and that's just two sports. And you've got two county cricket clubs whose home grounds are not even that far apart. I think they're like 2.5 miles apart, or 5 miles apart. Either side of the Thames, you've got the Oval and you've got Lords. So London really, it's ridiculous the amount of high quality stadiums and indoor arenas London actually has. Um, and I think that surprises a lot of North Americans, especially. Um, it really does. Um, it is the city with the most stadiums and arenas in it, where professional sport is played on a regular basis in multiple sports. And it absolutely does really surprise, um, especially those from the US, just how many sports teams are in London. Um, Now, the Canadians, you look at a city like Toronto, and Canadians is a little bit different, but there's some huge areas of London where there's a lot of deprivation, and average salaries are less, and living costs are ridiculous. But it does amaze a lot of Americans who are used to like one major league in the city, for example. So I'm trying to think of a city that only has the one. Is it Salt Lake City with only the NBA? I think it is. No, they've got MLS. Salt Lake City, for example, has the NBA and the MLS. Colorado has. I think Denver has. I think does Denver have the four, five, big five? I think it does. But you've got cities like San Jose has more than one. Is it Seattle? I think it's Seattle. That has only the no. Seattle has an MLS team. I'm trying to think of a city. No, Buffalo has two. But they're normally used to having one team in one sport and then one team in another sport, and that's sort of seen as a bit extreme. Maybe it's New Jersey. I think it could be New Jersey. Is it Newark? But basically, in North America, Jacksonville. There you go. Jacksonville is a big metropolitan city, but it's actually a small metropolitan area with only one major league team, and that's the Jaguars. There's Tampa and Miami. Well, Florida's actually got a lot of sports teams, but for the most part, um, when it comes to the major metropolitan areas, they might have two teams in the same sport, for example. Um, if Bracknell Town gets the first round again, which they have a very good chance of doing, they'll probably get back on the telly. And obviously, Bracknell Town's objective is to make it to the National League and then to the Football League. And I wouldn't be surprised if Bracknell Town and Sandhurst Town merged together. I mean, they'll probably call themselves like Bracknell Sandhurst FC or Bracknell Forest Football Club, because Bracknell Town is no longer based in Bracknell, it's now based in Sandhurst. And that was a council issue, and they were limited in what they could do with the old ground, which I used to live literally. I could on match nights and match days, I could hear the stadium from my house. Um, um, so let that sink in. Um, the fact that we're discussing qualifying rounds, I do think they could possibly start the FA Cup a bit earlier, first round proper, that is. Um, Personally, but in order for that to potentially happen, the FA would and the Football League would have to get rid of the Football League trophy altogether, and that is still an income earner for League One and League Two clubs. And their income streams and their finances are really, really stretched. If they become a Football League club and reach the Football League level, they can't play on a 3G pitch. It's because they're non-league they can do it. It's to save on main. The initial installation is expensive. Long term, the maintenance is cheap, and that's to reduce cost in the long term. And obviously, that little cut run they had last year has basically paid for that 3G pitch. I'm not a fan of them. I've played on them. You get horrible knee and ankle injuries from just there's no give. Um, there is absolutely no give. And when you have sliding for a sliding tackle, you just ripped half your leg off. When you get tackled and you fall awkwardly and you fall on your knee, or you twist, there is no giving them. They are horrible to play on. Hate them. The ball behaves differently. When you plant your foot, the force is going through your body is different because it's very springy. It's like not quite a trampoline. It's spongy. It's weird. The energy transfer through your body and into the ground and vice versa. I don't hate them. I've always hated them. I've never liked them. And you look at players who, in a variety of sports, who play on these 3 and 4G pitches or whatever they're, these hybrid pitches, the amount of injuries they have. And now the modern grass hybrid, 3G hybrid or whatever, where they stitch it together. Look at the Namibian centre who had his leg, as I describe it. I know his ankle was dislocated. I think he's done something to his knee as well. But there was no give in the pitch, and we noticed these pitches are rolling up the turf. You can pick them up in squares. They haven't allowed the new turf to bed in, root in. They're these hybrid pitches, and they're terrible. And yeah. Um, Look, I find it interesting, Jamie, that you obviously are really passionate about your non-league football. I think, and non-league football is the bedrock, is the foundations of how the footballing pyramid works in this country. It's the same overseas in Europe. The lower amateur, semi-pro, and then the lower professional leagues are the bedrock that the leagues are built on. Without them, you cannot sustain, Serie A, Bundesliga. The French league system's a mess anyway, because below the second tier, it's chronic. But even the French La Liga, the Portuguese system, the Swiss system, the Dutch, without these lower level amateur, semi-pro, and lower professional leagues, you cannot sustain the model. And right now, the model is not sustainable anyway, because it's overbalancing. So if you look at a building, they've got a nice strong foundation, and then you can build higher. What's happening though is the top league that they've completely warped the economics. I think there needs to be more exposure to the lower levels. So we need to look at the media rights deal and the TV deals we've got in place. If the National League was to go, stop the TV, we're going to use YouTube, for example, to reach a global audience, and we'll get rid of GeoBlock, that'd be fantastic, because then not only reach the domestic audience, reaching a global audience. And there are some big former Football League clubs that are in the non-league right now. We could say, I'm going to go Chesterfield. There you go. There's a prime example of a former Football League club that's sizable, who've been at a much higher level. You've got Yeovil Town in the non-league. You've got Torquay United, ex-Football League club, Southend. So these are some big clubs down in the non-league. I've got to do a video on Southend and Chesterfield and Yeovil. They're going to be fun videos to do of these former Football League clubs. And of course, Southend are in real financial peril right now, disappear off the face of the earth before too long. These are clubs that have been in higher levels of the Football League pyramid. I think, was it Chesterfield got to was it an FA Cup or a League Cup semi-final? I seem to remember, not that long ago. Or was it Macclesfield Town? I can't remember. Anyway, they've been at higher levels in the league pyramid. I think they've all been in the second tier. Let's just put it that way. And now suddenly they're all in the non-league. They're all struggling. I think if the non-league is serious about increasing their revenue streams and growing their footprint to a wider audience, sod the TV companies who are mugging them off. Go through platforms like YouTube, and suddenly they're going to reach a much bigger audience, both domestically and globally. Look at the Americans; they're buying into our domestic leagues like it's going out of fashion. But I will discuss the Everton situation, because obviously I know a lot of my viewers recently, a lot of the new subscribers are Irish and South African. There's a big surge from these rugby union following nations, and the viewership from Ireland and South Africa has been fantastic in the last week or so. Absolutely brilliant. I love my Saffers. I love my Irish as well. I've got Irish heritage. I've got a South African friend, and so I'm quite passionate about both the Irish and South African national sides doing well. I always like to see them do well. But no, I think we need to look at the future of sports broadcasting rights. I think social media platforms like YouTube are going to have a massive, massive part to play. They already do. There's already leagues and competitions that have agreements with YouTube for broadcasting and streaming games live and match highlights and full match replays on the platform, and it makes them money. which then goes back into sponsorship and into grassroots and into the finances. So, and they reach a bigger global audience. If you get rid of that geo block, like IIHF, get rid of the geo block, because obviously we have a domestic UK broadcaster which hosts broadcast the IIHF. Get rid of the geo block. Suddenly, you've got a much bigger audience that you are engaging with straight away, and the potential for growth of ice hockey globally is bigger. You reach a bigger audience. Get rid of those geo blocks. But I do think the way football finances work now in the European and South American games, we need to drastically address. And then I want to get onto the Everton situation, and then what's also going on at Manchester United, because there's part and parcel. We'll start with Manchester United first. They've lost against Brighton at home, 3-1, convincingly outplayed. And then we've got to look at the off-field issues surrounding several players and the culture within that football club, and whether Eric Ten Hag is truly the right guy to take the club forward or not. And you look at the situation with Greenwood, you look at the situation with Anthony, the Brazilian player, and then you look at the Sancho situation. And it does say to me that there is a cultural issue at that club. When I talk about culture, about the type of characters you want in the dressing room and you want working day-to-day in the non-footballing roles at that football club. Culture starts at the top, and that's the Glazers. They're very standoff owners. They hire people to do their bidding, and they just take money out of the football club. That's basically what the Glazers are, which is very similar to the Everton 777 enterprise, I think it is, or investment, whatever it's called, wanting to buy off Mashiri and put in a takeover bid and purchase Everton. I think it's 777 Investments. And one of their investment partners has had a drugs conviction for drug smuggling. So if they pass the fit and proper persons test with the director's test, I might as well put in to buy a football club for a quid, because quite honestly, if a convicted drug smuggler who was charged with possession with intent to supply and smuggling can buy into a football club, then sod it, the Taliban can. And that's my honest opinion. You might as well say anyone can now own a football club, because, well, we've allowed a convicted drug smuggler to buy one. They allowed Cellini to buy Leeds, and he was done for tax evasion and fraud and embezzlement. So let that sink in. Just let that sink in. They allowed the Oystons to buy Blackpool. So anything is obviously allowable now in football, as long as money's coming in and whatever. And all of these owners were shockingly bad owners. Let that sink in. The director's test is a joke. If it was properly enforced, the original Bury would still be a football club. Southend United would not be going bankrupt. Is it Mansfield or Macclesfield Town that went out of business? If the director's test was properly adhered to, half the Premier League owners wouldn't be allowed to own the clubs that they own. The Newcastle takeover wouldn't have happened. The Man City takeover wouldn't have happened. The Glazers would have been forced to sell donkeys ago. Abramovich would never have been allowed to buy Chelsea. So let that sink in. I watched a great documentary the other day about the rival American football competitions, 60s and subsequent merger. Yeah, I've done a little bit. This is basically the Super Bowl era, is the aftermath of that. Of course, you've got the CFL in Canada and their expansion into the US into the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, which nearly bankrupted the league, which is why the league is on its knees now. Yeah, because they merge it in, but they still call it the NFL, because the NFL had a better brand, basically, had a better relationship with match-going fans, and I think had a better TV deal as well. They could have called it the All-American Football League, which would be the AAFL, but they decided to go with NFL because it said national rather than American. It seemed to have a better ring to it. I'm going to have to look in. I'm going to have to do a video on the NFL AFL merger and do some content on that. But it's like the MHL merging with the surviving WHA teams in 1979. And the rival league failed. It's like the LIV Golf trying to rival the PGA has been forced to merge with it because they were spending money they didn't technically have. They were spending too much money. And you look at the Super League. Well, the rival league to the established order, ironically, always fails. It depends on the length of time it takes to go belly up, but it always fails. Now, same with Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball is exactly the same. The NHL has had several rivals to it and has absorbed them. The WHA was the last serious attempt to. I think the International Hockey League, the IHL, tried in the 90s and they were spending money, but um, is the NFL the richest? I don't think it is. Like the American, the Super Bowl was the biggest, the most watched sporting event in the US, but it's not globally. The Champions League final gets more money, revenue, and TV viewership globally than the Super Bowl. Um, it used to be baseball used to have a higher viewership than the Major League Baseball used to have a higher viewership than the NFL. That's no longer the case. The NHL used to have a higher viewership than the NBA. That is no longer the case. But when you look at revenues and then viewership, they're two different things because what advertisers are willing to pay for the TV companies and the sponsorships. And then you look at the cost of operating the sports. Ice hockey is more expensive to operate an ice hockey team, an arena, than the NBA and MLS and baseball. NFL, I think, yeah, there's certain equipment costs, but again, not as much. Which then you've got revenue and profit are two different things. Revenue coming in and then profit loss are actually separate. In terms of salaries, the NBA has some pretty ridiculous salaries. The average salaries is made higher by the top end players, whereas the top end salaries in the NHL and the lowest, the league minimum, are a lot closer than the other major leagues. The Major League Baseball was the only one without a salary cap. So the haves and have-nots in the NHL is less, but the league makes half as much revenue as Major League Baseball. So we're talking NHL is about 5 to 7 billion. Major League Baseball was about 10 to 12 billion, depending on how you look at income revenue. Revenue and income are different, and profit are all different bits and pieces because you've got post and pre-tax revenue and post and pre-tax profits and losses and various ways to move money around. But Major League Baseball was the only major league without a salary cap, luxury tax system. But I can definitely look at average salary, minimum salary, and maximum salary. We can absolutely. I don't think there is a maximum salary in Major League Baseball, but we can definitely. I can definitely look at. I can definitely do a video looking at the major leagues. Look at minimum salary, maximum salary, average salary. And you can definitely see the NHL was much closer in league minimum to what is currently the biggest salary going. It's not length of contract, it's not the amount that the salary is worth, which is around, I think, $12 million. It's length of term, which I think is 8 years, is the maximum now. We will breach that salary ceiling, but the league minimum is what you've got to look at for salary cap purposes. But no, the NFL is the most profitable league. A lot of Americans look at what the TV deal is worth when they're not actually looking at what the valuation of the product is. But you've got is it a 30 team league or 32 team league in the NFL? So you've already got more teams in the Premier League, which is 20. But on the same flip coin, you have less games played per year in the NFL, so you're going to get less game receipts. But then you've got to look at average ticket price and compare it and then you've got to get exchange rate in there, and cost of inflation, and then you've got to look at the salaries that are paid out to non-playing staff within the organisation. And of course, the Premier League is different from year to year because teams get promoted and relegated. So at the moment, the 3 teams at the bottom are the 3 promoted teams are the bottom 3. So not every league season is different because you've got a different team, 3 different teams in there than last year, or 6 team turnover basically. 3 teams go down, 3 teams come up. And it's the same with the Championship, which is is it the third most profitable league in the world in football terms? Championship for value and viewership. So the plus the business models are different. The league structures are different, and there is no salary cap in football. There's no spending cap in football. There's financial fair play, so there's a percentage of lost profit rule, and are your losses exceeding earnings? Um, in the major leagues in North America, there's a system put in place that especially in the NHL, because some years every team makes a profit. In theory, can make a profit, so they don't have to basically support the loss-making teams. I think at the moment there's a handful of teams that are basically supported by league revenue, where the 10 wealthiest will support, or the top earners. If it's only the bottom three, let's say three teams are making a loss, the wealthiest three will top up. If it's or the wealthiest 10, there's a system in place where, because there is revenue sharing, that they can be supported. Do I think the financial bubble will burst? I think it's deflating. Whatever Simon Jordan says on Talksport, I wouldn't fully agree with. I think it's starting to deflate. Hence why the European Super League idea got really thrust upon us, and restructuring the Premier League, got thrust upon us by Liverpool, Man United, and they got made to look very, very silly, and were told to leave the room. And then the European Super League comes along, and fans basically said, "Well, it's not our fault. You've got yourselves in massive debt that you can't now sustain because there's been an economic shutdown. You were getting away with it too long." You just have to look in Spain, for example, and how La Liga and the Spanish Federation have got themselves into their situation they have. Well, football's finances are built upon debt, and they're overpaying contracts. Transfer fees are paid in instalments, like basically like a mortgage or a loan. You pay back over with a payment plan. The reason why Bordeaux got a points deduction and relegated is because Barcelona haven't paid them a transfer fee yet that they're still waiting for, that predates COVID. Bordeaux are waiting for money from Barcelona for, is it 4 or 5 years now? That hasn't been paid in a timely fashion. Now, that led them to basically go, "We haven't got any money." So PSG obviously can spend what they want. The rest of the French, even Monaco's got like one of the wealthiest, and Nice got wealthy owners. And they're like, "We cannot financially compete with PSG because they've got a sovereign wealth fund funding them. We've got private individuals, for example. There's only so much money we can actually spend before we're in breach of financial fair play by club revenues and losses. Not how much the owner's worth, but how much the club is worth and how much the club generates." That's where people get confused. But the transfer system is broken. I think they're completely um, ridiculous fees. I did a video about the summer transfer window and the record being broken. This is not sustainable. These are the same clubs that 3 years ago were screaming for government assistance with the furlough scheme and asking for government assistance to help bail us out. And it, um, I think they've even accelerated and overheated it even further. I wouldn't have said it would have gone bust. I think it was. I think what's happened is less fans are buying the subscription TV packages. A lot of fans are being priced out from actually going to games, which has alienated a lot of fan bases, especially in the UK at least. Germany's quite affordable to go and watch games, but I don't know about how it is across all the leagues in Europe, but I know fans are feeling uh, priced out. I think the overinflated the wages are massively out of control, um, which then puts added strain upon football clubs to obviously meet their contractual obligations to their players. There's a lot of clubs that, especially Chelsea, for example, who like sacking managers almost on the daily. They've got to pay these managers out because they've terminated their contract early contract termination. They've got to pay them compensation. I mean, look, do you know how much money like Mourinho made out of his made in compensation payments, Conte and all that? They've made a lot of money. Pochettino's made a lot of money. I mean, Big Sam Allardyce seems to like getting the financial payments is not just transfer fees; it's also the wages and salaries. They are massively out of control. Ticket prices have ballooned to an unsustainable level. But bearing in mind, when I set this channel up as a blog, it was just a video diary. Nothing's, I didn't think it would go anywhere. I used YouTube as a platform to vent my frustrations with the world. And then the Neymar transfer happens, that record-breaking transfer happens, and suddenly the game had completely changed. Bearing in mind, Ronaldinho, the most he ever went for was 36 million, and people go, "That's ridiculous. That's true, mind-blowing sums of money." When Alan Shearer went for was it 16 million or six? Yeah, I think it was 16 million. Alan Shearer was the most expensive English player of all time in 1996 when he went from Blackburn to Newcastle United. Not long after we won the Premier League, we sold him to Newcastle, and that was seen as like a ridiculous transfer at the time. Was it 6 million? I can't remember. It was definitely had a 6 in the transfer. Was it 6 or 60? I can't remember. But Newcastle United were one of the most valuable clubs at the time in the world for what the club was valued at. They was the second most valuable club in England. I think they were the sixth most valuable club in Europe at that time in the mid to late 90s. They were seen as that kind of value because they were regularly in the Champions League and making, fighting for league titles and making FA Cup finals. That transfer fee was bananas. Obviously, he repaid the club with his goal scoring seasons and being the greatest Premier League goal scorer of all time in the Premier League era. But we can debate who was the best goal scorer in English footballing history at top level. I mean, when Trevor Francis was signed by Nottingham Forest for £1 million, people went, "What? This is ridiculous." And obviously, it did pay off with Trevor Francis when he was a Nottingham Forest player, and they win all that silverware. And at the time, people were going, "Oh, well, he's only playing for Birmingham. He's not that great a player." Birmingham are a fantastic club; they're a decent club, and Nottingham Forest and Brian Clough were like, "No, we're having him. And this is how much we're going to pay for him." And the risk did pay off. There was a reward ultimately in the end. But that was seen as shocking at the time. And obviously, Diego Maradona becomes the world's most expensive football player for dollars. They used dollars to all the various different exchange rates in the 80s. He becomes the world's most expensive player when he leaves Boca Juniors and goes to Barcelona. And that wasn't long after Trevor Francis is signed for Nottingham Forest. So Trevor Francis is the most expensive player in the world. And it's Diego Maradona a couple of years later. And at that time, people were like, "This is ridiculous." But you look at it, at that time, they were two of the most successful players for trophies won and what they were doing in the game. Ironically, Trevor Francis won more silverware than Diego Maradona. But that's at club level. International level, Diego Maradona wins a World Cup. So, balances out, doesn't it? But at that time, they were the two most expensive players in the world. Within a decade, the Premier League comes along. And then I think Alan Shearer was the most expensive player in the world for like a week or something when that transfer was done. And then it goes out, balloons up. But then I do seem to remember that Ronaldinho, the most he ever went for in transfer fee was 36 million. Look at some of the transfer fees now; they are obscene, and the player quality level is not a Ronaldinho. Ronaldinho, for me, was better than Cristiano Ronaldo, and Messi. Ronaldinho is a far better player than those two, far better player. And his maximum transfer fee was 36 million. So we'll let that sink in. And some of the price tags being put on players, like if PSG was to sell Messi, it would have to be 400 million. But and I'm thinking, how can you put that clause into the contract? Who is going to be able to be within spending rules and be able to afford that unless you've got a sovereign wealth fund like Newcastle? No one is going to be within financial fair play. because it's the club alone. It's not the owner. It is the club's profitability. People confuse the two or don't fully understand. Um, oh look, the German system is, yeah, it's a lot cheaper, but that doesn't mean uh, that their transfer fees aren't ridiculous and their wages aren't ridiculous. Um, they're still paying big transfer fees. They're still paying high wages, and a lot of the clubs are hand to mouth existence in that sense. Um, is it Union Berlin that basically had to rely on the fans to build their stadium when they were admitted back into the fully unified German league system? They had no money. Their stadium was in a terrible state because of communism, and even Hertha Berlin fans, rolled their sleeves up and helped build the stadium that they use today, or the stadium that they. So they had no money. Borussia Dortmund have had the biggest fan base in Germany. Borussia Dortmund, the club has had financial issues more than once. Um, so Stuttgart have had. So while we may appreciate the German system, there's a debate of whether it's a perfect system. I think it may control, it may change the, the, the balance of power, so to speak. But look, at the end of the day, as I said, football is no longer my favourite sport. Um, I could have done a video on Hans Flick being sacked by Germany because of the poor run of form. I could have done a video on the Everton potential takeover, and I think I will at some point. Uh, Looking at potential Everton takeover, and is it actually going to be a good thing for Everton? Because I don't think it will be. I don't think Sean Dyche will still be manager once that takeover is fully completed. And I do fear for the future of Everton Football Club long term. But the fact that Mashiri, I don't think has himself has done bad by the club. I think he's been willing to spend the money. The people advising him have screwed him over, and Bill Kenwright is a toxic element to Everton Football Club. Now that if this sale goes through, Kenwright's gone, but then you get this weird American investment group, similar to the Glazers, but without a specific family wanting to use themselves as and one of the potential partners in that investment portfolio has got a conviction for drug smuggling. Now, you look at the other clubs they've invested in. Yeah, it's not. It doesn't make for pretty reading, and it's not. It makes me worry about Everton going forward. It always amazes me how the Bundesliga lags behind the English, Italian, Spanish leagues, considering Germany's out of Europe. I wouldn't say it lags behind. You look at European club football history, you look at the German football league system. Yeah, Bayern have won the majority, but actually, when I do my club history videos, they've done well. You look at how it's distributed, and you look at the European competitions, they've done reasonably well. But you've got to look at the sporting landscape in Germany. Ice hockey is exceptionally popular. They've got their ice hockey league is actually quite profitable. Basketball is quite popular. They love their motorsport in Germany. So their sporting landscape, they love their winter sports, in the Alps as well. So their sporting landscape is different fundamentally, and their Olympic program is different. I wouldn't say their football league underperforms. I don't think it does. I think they've had a great history in European football. They've won a lot of German clubs have won a lot of silverware at various points. You look at how many international trophies the national side have won. The distribution of trophies and it's this. People it amazes me. Yes, Bayern have dominated for most of the last 15 years. I think that dominance is starting to ebb away slowly. They're not winning everything all the time. But with the situation of the national side at the moment, I think they're going to have to look at potentially putting a salary cap or a transfer cap in place in German football. Because when it comes to Bayern, they hoover up all the best talent that's based domestically. And I think that is starting to have a negative impact. The league start. But when you've got clubs like Eintracht Frankfurt and winning trophies and Dortmund and Union Berlin and clubs like that starting to really put pressure on Bayern in the Bundesliga itself, and winning and competing for trophies in Europe other than Bayern, it suddenly changes the conversation. But the problem is you've got other big clubs that are struggling. Hamburg at the moment. Werder Bremen aren't the powerhouse they once were. Bayer Leverkusen aren't in the top four anymore. You've got Red Bull Leipzig, but there's question marks over the way their ownership works and how it goes against the traditional German model, and how that's altering. But as I say, things are changing in German football, and the shift is happening. And people always dismiss some of the other European leagues, like the Swiss league and the Austrian league. Oh, they're not very competitive. They're not very good. But you look at it historically. Actually, a lot of clubs in their domestic league systems have won a lot. Ironically, they're more competitive than people realise. And the French league system has had the most league winners. No one team is truly dominated by a massive margin. St Etienne and PSG, I think, are tied for the league titles at 10 each. And St Etienne obviously aren't in the top flight anymore, but they're tied. And you actually look at the French league and go, wow, that is a really interesting league system, because the maximum of league titles won is 10. That's St Etienne and PSG. And then you go, wow, this is interesting. I've got to do some more club histories. I'm going to look at some French clubs. I'm going to look at Nantes and Auxerre and Montpellier and Marseille. Marseille's an interesting one because of the corruption scandal. Lyon, they're the first French club to win 4 league titles in a row. PSG have now surpassed that, but they were the first French club to do that in their dominance spell back in the early 2000s. They were a great club in the early 2000s, Lyon. But only one French club has won the Champions League, and that's Marseille. So for all the money PSG and Monaco have spent in their time, and Monaco have spent a fair bit, they've only got 2 Champions League finals between them, and they both lost. And I watched both Champions League finals as they both lost. So let that sink in. And you look at some of the great players that have played for both clubs before they got stupidly wealthy. And even now, Monaco has to reduce their spending because the club doesn't generate enough revenue. That's not the fact that the owner isn't stupidly wealthy, it's the club as the standalone entity doesn't generate enough revenue to be within European financial fair play rules if they were to spend like no tomorrow. But they've been very successful as a club. I think the most interesting club to win the French top flight is Auxerre. And they did it one season. They haven't won a lot, Auxerre. They're a very interesting one. Strasbourg is an interesting one as well. Lille are very interesting. RC Lens are very interesting. Le Havre is another one. You've got Nantes, Nancy, AS Nancy, very interesting. Grenoble. There's so many French clubs to look at, and then but PSG dominates the headlines, and that's where they go, oh, the French league's not competitive. I think PSG, with them now trying to slash their wage bill, get rid of all their overpaid talent, and they are overpaid, I think is a sign that they're not going to be the top dogs in France for much longer. I think their period of winning all the time is coming to an end. The difference between Germany and France is the French league doesn't have a domestic broadcast partner that broadcasts every weekend. I think is it 8 or 10 games a year that are broadcast on Amazon and Canal Plus. The broadcast deal collapsed during COVID, so the French league has a really poor broadcast deal. I think it's a highlights only package, but to the domestic audience, which then just doesn't work. Yeah, France's league system is in a mess. La Ligue is in a mess. Italian football's in a financial mess. Our league system's in a financial mess. The German league system is the best run league system, and there are still clubs in Germany that have financial struggles. Dresden is a prime example of a club that is in trouble right now. Dortmund is a club in past years that's had financial issues. Hertha Berlin, who the potential buyers of Everton currently own, are not doing well at the moment. And these are clubs with big fan bases, by the way. This is not FC Cologne, Kaiserslautern. There's quite a few that are really buggered financially in Germany at the moment, and they've got a great ownership model and fan involvement for the most part. There's a couple of clubs where there's a rather wealthy benefactor and the fans aren't as involved in the protests, but RB Leipzig being the prime example. There's a few other clubs. I think it's Bielefeld, where the owner is a bit like RB Leipzig, but and there are very strict rules about ownership and branding, and they do have the very strict rules when it comes to the fans have to be involved for the most part. But like I say, like the European club is a shambles. I think I'm a member of a couple of football fan pages on Facebook, and Legia Warsaw fans every home game they get these massive banners up, and they're basically giving two fingers to UEFA, going, "You are fat pigs. You are destroying the game. You've allowed the bad owners in. Chase the money. You're ripping off the fans. You don't stand for football clubs, really. You don't stand for anything apart from greed." And it's true. It is true. There is a disconnect between a lot of fans and the governing bodies of UEFA and FIFA. And you could argue that about a lot of sports, that there is a growing disconnect between the clubs and the governance and the fans, some of the club hierarchies, and owners and board members and chairmen, and there is a growing disconnect. And I feel that disconnect because I'm part of that disconnect. I feel that the game and the sport that I grew up idolising, right, and playing at school and worshipping as a kid growing up, I was obsessed. I'm growing to despise. I'm growing to hate the sport I used to love. I will still do football content, obviously. I'll still cover when the managers get hired, sacked. I think Sean Dyche is probably the first manager to get sacked this season, personally. I will obviously follow that. If this takeover for Everton goes ahead, I will do content on that. But I'm falling out of love with the sport more and more every day. But I'll still do the content for the channel, and obviously for everyone who is a football fan who subscribes and watches and engages. And because otherwise, I'm doing you guys a disservice by not covering as much as possible. It's why I covered the Greenwood situation from start to end. I think I will start doing content on the Anthony situation should he be charged with any offence. Jadon Sancho, if he's forced out, I don't think Jadon Sancho plays for Man United. Well, if Eric Ten Hag is sacked as manager, which could happen, I think Sancho plays for United again. If he stays long term as manager and turns this poor start of the season around, Sancho's out the door at Man United. But then again, Mourinho tried, Solskjaer tried, and now Ten Hag have tried with the Sancho thing. Guardiola is the reason why he left Man City. He goes to Dortmund. He comes to Manchester United. They spent a long time pursuing him under Mourinho. They believed he was the guy. Solskjaer, I think, was the interim manager when he gets signed, and then he becomes the full-time manager. And Ed Woodward was the guy in at the time. But then the issues that are plaguing football with money issues are played in rugby league, they're played in rugby union, and then you actually look at the major sports in the US, and not all the teams in the US major leagues are profitable. They may be valued at a certain value, but they're not all profitable. A lot of them are making a loss, but they are subsidised by the revenue sharing agreement that the league head office and all the owners have. So if your team is actually making a loss, don't worry, we'll support you so you break even or make a profit through revenue sharing. And the teams that make the most money, okay, we're making a little bit less this year because it's revenue sharing, but we'll make sure this team isn't going bust. But you look at it in real terms, there are teams losing money in the major leagues in North America. There are teams in the AFL and NRL that are struggling financially in Australia, for example. Um, and when the pandemic hit, it did actually expose a lot of these organisations, teams, and the owners to the financial situation. Um, because of the franchise model in North America, obviously there are some teams with arena and stadium issues. So obviously the Arizona Coyotes is the one that gets brought up. The Oakland A's is the other one that gets brought up because of their ongoing arena and stadium issues. But there's also ownership issues there as well. There you go. Look, you'll love my football club history series that I've been doing for the last year and a half. Well, I actually started in 2018. I did a few videos, but I've really religiously ramped it up. I started last summer at the end of last season, and I've basically been doing it in blocks, either mid-season or when there's not a lot of news happening in sport. Do a club video. I'm running out of clubs that I can do history content on. Ironically, I'm going to have to start looking at more of the European leagues. I've done a fair few in Spain, Germany. I think I might look at some of the French clubs, like Saint Etienne, like Auxerre, Strasbourg, Marseille. But I've got loads of them. And you just got to go into the football playlist and go a brief history of, and then suddenly you've got, I think it's over 100 videos now at this point, 120. I've done most of the football. I think there's about 3 or 4 football league clubs I haven't done. There's a load of the non-league that are professional in the National League and National League North and South that I should and could do content. Load in Scotland still to do. Rangers and Celtic being the obvious ones, but there's loads of others. And then Europe, just Europe. I could do Munich. I could do Juventus. But what I find interesting is some of the clubs that have got great histories. The view counts from some clubs, which don't get the recognition I think they deserve, are actually higher than the bigger clubs. So I've got view counts that are higher for shit. There's some clubs in the Football League where the view counts are higher on their club histories than Man United and Liverpool and Arsenal. And I'm not joking. The view counts are higher on some of them. Oh, look, I can definitely look at revisiting, the '94 World Cup. What I would say is I generally do like my favourite starting lineups or my all time player profiles on players that I've watched. So when I'm obviously doing my World Cricket Test 11 revisiting in 2023, I did a video. I think back it was either 2018 or 2019. I did a video then. The team list that I put out in 2023 is very similar to the 2018 and 2019. I can't remember what. I'll have to look at my cricket playlist at what year I actually did my all-time cricketing 11. I think it was. I'm gonna have to double check that. And the coach then, the coach in this video was a player in my all-time 11 in 2018. Obviously, opinions change, and I thought, hang on a second, this is Test and world and first class cricket here. In fact, and that could be all format. I think AB de Villiers, and I've changed the criteria a little bit. You've got to be retired for so long. But for the most part, I think my list, is 90% the same. There's a handful of names that are different. If I was to do my all-time rugby 15, as in rugby union, it'd be pretty interesting. My all-time England football, 11, I think, because more players have now retired. But you look at it, you look at my starting lineups. I think if you look at my football ones in Premier League, I do my all-time Premier League 11, and I do my all-time football starting 11, and I do my all-time English starting 11. They are very heavily dominated by players who played in the 90s and the early 2000s. Very heavily dominated. And could say, why is that? Because I had a great connection with the sport at that time. Um, so if you look at my all-time football 11s, World 11, English 11, and Premier League 11, um, you will notice very dominated by players who played in the 90s and the 2000s, not in the 2010s, who've now retired. Very heavily dominated. You would say, why is that? And you look at it and you go, that's actually a pretty stacked team. Pretty stacked team. I think in my all-time 11, do I have the original Ronaldo? I might do. I don't think I do actually. If I the amount of football videos I've done, I would have to take hours to scroll through. But I don't think the original Ronaldo makes my all-time 11. He might do. I know Batistuta's in there. I know Batistuta's one of my forwards, but I think Taffarel is definitely the goalkeeper. I could have gone for Barthez. I could have gone for Tim Flowers. Blackburn fan, but then there's a bias there. He was a great goalkeeper. I could have gone for Peter Schmeichel, who was one of my favourite goalkeepers, even though he played for Man United and Man City and Aston Villa. Peter Schmeichel played for both Manchester clubs. That is an interesting one, considering the standing he has with Man United fans. The fact he played for Man City, let that sink in. Very few players have played for both clubs. Carlos Tevez is another player who's played for both clubs. Peter Schmeichel is a player who's played for both clubs. There are very few players who play for both Man City and Man United that I can think of. Dennis Law, yes, that's another one, but very, very few. Very few. I think there's only one player who's played for both Everton and Liverpool, I believe, and I think it was Ablett, and I believe he's now passed away. But I think he was one of the very few who's played for both at senior level. I can't think of many who played for both Everton and Liverpool. It's just how it works out. It's like Newcastle, Sunderland. Peter Peter Beardsley. Peter Beardsley played for Liverpool, and did he play for Everton? I know he played for Newcastle. Did Peter Beardsley play for both Everton and Newcastle? Nick Barmby. I know he played. I know he played for Leeds and Hull. Nicky Barmby. Nick Barmby at his best was a brilliant player. Fantastic player. At his peak at Leeds United was a brilliant player. By the time he's at Hull, he's done. He's on the way out. But he was a brilliant player in his time. But no, we've had some great players, play the game, and I think the 90s and the 2000s. I mean, the talent level across Europe was at a much higher level than it is now, and a lot of the lesser European leagues were at a higher quality level than they are now because of the UEFA coefficient and the restructuring of the club competitions of Europe. It's had a negative impact on a lot of leagues in Europe, and of course Scotland is a prime example that I use, and the Dutch league as well. I think this is where UEFA have got their coefficient ranking wrong. I think this is how they structured the club competitions wrong. They should never have got rid of the Cup Winners' Cup, and they basically bowed down to the wealthiest European clubs who want this European Super League dynamic. When they restructure the Champions League every time, and they bowed down to them, they caved again. They said we're going to strictly punish, we're going to really punish them, but they've now buggered these clubs with their new financial fair play rules. So they sort of give a little with the European restructuring of the Champions League, but then they go, well, we're going to give you what you want in a way, but not in a way, but it's similar. It's by the back door, but now we're going to bug you on financial fair play, and now we're going to strictly enforce it. And now clubs like PSG are going, oh, we're going to be buggered, which they are. Oh yeah, Peter Beardsley. He's a controversial character with what's gone on with some of the allegations against him of being a bit of a racist, homophobic bully towards players and his training methods, and that has raised some eyebrows. Same with Craig Bellamy. He there's been eyebrows raised about him by the clubs he's worked at. Now, talking about sport, if you follow the NHL, Mike Babcock has now departed the Columbus Blue Jackets without even coaching a preseason game. Um, there were allegations raised on the Spitting Chicklets podcast. Now, I think, you know, Ryan Whitney and Paul Bizanet, the Biz, are both absolute clowns. Whatnot. It was, yeah, but I've got my views on the Spitting Chicklets podcast and whether how. Now, we don't know exactly what's gone on, but the NHLPA have reported to the league their report that they've gathered from the players who've raised concerns with the Players Association. What's been said on the Spitting Chicklets and the Barstool Sports podcast family and Barstool Sports as the media arm that, you know, Spitting Chicklets part of the Barstool Sports family. What they allege has happened is different to what's been said by Jenna, the player. He's a very good player, by the way, in the NHL, and Babcock, the head coach. There are other allegations that haven't publicly been made public about what's actually gone on. But one of the players within the group has obviously leaked something, which has now started the ball rolling. Whether the NHLPA were already investigating Babcock for what's gone on. And when we talk about Peter Beardsley and what's happened with him as a youth coach and the allegations made against him and Craig Bellamy and other youth coaches about racism, homophobia and abuse and all that, how they treat youngsters and all that. And what's obviously happened with Crew Alexander and other clubs with the abuse scandal that part. Mike Babcock was sacked by the Toronto Maple Leafs for allegations about him assaulting players. When I say something like kicking them on the bench, verbally abusing them, openly making homophobic and racist remarks towards players. So basically being a bully, not a very nice guy. He loses his job at the Maple Leafs just before COVID in 2019. He then took a coaching gig in the NCAA. He's then hired by Columbus. Now it's 4 or 5 years out of the NHL. 4 years out of the NHL, I believe. And there's a way back in for him at the top level. There was another coach from Calgary who got accused of racism and again assaulting players by kicking and punching them, and not necessarily being okay in that sense. At roughly the same time, so Calgary and the Calgary Flames and the Toronto Maple Leafs sacked their coaches a few weeks apart. Very damaging allegations that the NHL have to deal with. And then the Chicago Blackhawks abuse scandal comes out following COVID, and what we now know about what happened there. So there's definitely a culture shift within the sport. There's still a culture that players and non-playing staff, do they feel comfortable making complaints about other players? And then you've got the Hockey Canada investigation due to be published, that publication of that report into what happened in 2018 in a World Juniors camp and the allegations against players there, and what players were actively involved in what happened, and there's ongoing stuff there. So the sport of ice hockey, and especially the NHL, is under the spotlight right now for the culture within ice hockey. And then we look at the culture within football with the allegations against players like Anthony and Mason Greenwood, and what's going on with Jadon Sancho and the Mendy situation, and then what goes on with Kyle Walker and some of the stuff he did during COVID, and the culture within football here in the UK and obviously across Europe with players. There's an Australian one of the French players got a suspended sentence for assault. There was racist allegations around that in rugby union in the World Cup. So there's a lot going on in professional sport, and professional sport is under the spotlight for what goes on. And then you hear of stuff going on within NCAA programs and the US gymnastics team, and then issues within US men's and women's football setups and Canadian football setups. And then there's a lot coming out, and a lot of eyebrows and questions being raised, and a lot of internal, and it's just a mess. just a mess. So yeah, we can say Peter Beardsley was a great player. He was. He was a very talented player. Um, However, we now look at him and we go, well, is he a particularly nice individual? The answer would be no. We look at what's going on with Ryan Giggs. Is he a very talented player? Yes, he's one of Manchester United's greatest ever players. But then you look at the allegations of his private life and his legal issues, and you go, is he a nice bloke? Probably not. And then you circle back to that culture at Man United, and you look at Man United's culture with the issues now with Mason Greenwood and Anthony, for example, and the allegations against them. And bearing in mind, just because it didn't reach court at this time doesn't mean Mason Greenwood's not out of hot water legally. There could be further charges brought, and you could get into hot water again. They've just shelved the investigation, right? I don't think he plays for Manchester United again. Now, Eric Ten Hag has come in as manager, and he's inherited Sancho and Greenwood from the previous, you know, setup. Well, Giggs as a coach, I think off-field dramas and away from the playing setup is definitely where the issues lie. But then you have to look at it, and he was involved with the youth setup at Manchester United when Mason Greenwood is in his formative years. He was involved as an assistant at Manchester United post-retirement. Obviously, he's a club legend, so he does spend a lot of time at that football club. And then the questions have to be asked about the culture within that organisation. And the culture starts at the top. Now, the same could be said for Everton, because there's been allegations against some Everton players as well. There's been allegations against a lot of players for a lot of misdeeds, not just domestic violence and violence against women, but back in the day with Lee Bowyer and Kieran Dyer and a few other players, John Terry and Jody Morris at Chelsea. And the allegations against culture actually starts at the top. And when you have a toxic culture, it flows through your organisation. And we've seen it in professional sport in the US, Canada. We've seen it in professional sport in Australia and New Zealand. There's a lot of allegations against a lot of high-profile athletes and sports administrators in Australia. Seriously, you look at it, and it sums up. You have to ask questions of clubs like Man United about, well, not only on scouting but due diligence. So director of football going, okay, so this player may be a good player on the field, but what does he bring off the field? Does he bring good leadership? Does he bring a good marketability? Is he good in the community? What's he like? What's his character like as a person? And this is where they fail with Mason Greenwood. This is where they fail with Jadon Sancho. This is where they fail with Anthony. This is where they fail with Martial. His attitude sucks. It's completely non-existent. And that's a big question. Is like, what are these players like as individuals? What do they bring into a dressing room, into the club? Do they buy into the culture? Hardworking, loyal, transparent, open, honest. The hardworking aspect, the loyalty aspect, the community aspect as well. Being good in the community, these are attributes you also need as a high level professional athlete. Respect. A lot of these players now, not just in football but in a lot of sports, lack respect, loyalty, work ethic, attitudes. They lack it. They've got all the skill and all the ability. They lack all the other things that you need. Those character traits that actually make a good leader, good teammate, and a good person. And then you have to ask, okay, is it the win at all cost mentality where you just get the most skilled player in, but he may be a toxic piece of shit, basically, nasty piece of work, or do you look at the other attributes: leadership, respect, work ethic, community, going out and being engaging with the community. Um, you know, charity. Do they do a lot of charity work? Would they volunteer for the tough assignments that you give them? When you go on training camps or some of the military style training camps, are they taking the lead? Are they rising above what was expected of them? Are they pushing themselves hard? Are they helping their teammates? Not just pushing their teammates, but when there's a teammate struggling in a task, are they going, "Don't worry, I'll get you through this. I'm going to help you through." That is the mark of a more rounded individual who may also be the type of player to take less money for the team, to get paid less. It's not about the money. It's not about the prestige. It's not about the social media likes and all that. They may be the ones who go, "I'll take a hometown discount, so you can go out and sign that superstar player." That's where your true leaders and captains come from. Giving the captaincy to the most skilled player or the superstar player often backfires. In my personal opinion, I don't agree with it. You've got to go for the guy who's the leader in the dressing room. He is the guy in your leadership group who's setting the standards. He may not be the most skilled, he may not be the most photogenic, he may not be the most marketable individual. He is the one who sets your standards. So that's when I look at your Roy Keanes. Was he the best marketable midfielder? No. The only way you could market Roy Keane was in a rivalry match against Liverpool, against Arsenal, or against Newcastle at that time. Because his rivalry with Vieira, his rivalry with Shearer. Who was the Liverpool captain at the time? Well, Liverpool going through a lot of captains at the time, but certain aspects about Liverpool, like his rivalry with Carragher, for example. That's where you could sell Roy Keane as a marketable asset. He was an angry man. He was I think Haaland from Man City and Leeds. That's where you could really sell Roy Keane. Was it David Batty for Blackburn and Leeds? Batty midfielder. That's where Roy Keane was a marketable asset. He was a nasty piece of work on the field, but he drove standards in the dressing room. Effort, effort, effort. Accountability, and effort. No dickhead policy. So if you partied a bit too hard, he did not talk to you. He hated. Paul Ince, the governor, was again drove standards. Brian Robson drove standards. As time has gone on, more bad characters have got in there with character. So Wayne Rooney, yeah, he is a flawed character. He's not a nasty human being, but he's got his flaws to his character. In the Roy Keane era, he does not get signed. But Fergie sees this player at Everton, knows there's a talent there. Everton are desperate to keep him, but no, Man United have that pulling power. They're not going to keep him forever because Everton aren't winning trophies at that time. Phenomenal talent. But he's a flawed talent because he has his vices. He drinks too much and he likes women. Basically, Wayne Rooney's flaw. I don't think Wayne Rooney's a nasty individual in any way. On the field, passionate. But again, even though Wayne Rooney wasn't necessarily the fittest player, his work rate, his energy off the ball, and again, driving standards. He really was passionate when a teammate misplaced the pass. He would do the end-to-end running. He would run around like a lunatic. But he wasn't necessarily the most physically, of ripped like a Ronaldo. But he definitely was an energy player, a leader, definitely drove standards, was a great captain for the club. He was basically the English Roy Keane in that dressing room, but he did have flaws. In saying that, he was a true leader of that club, and he was a bit more marketable because of how he burst onto the scene as a young player. Wayne Rooney is one of those players that grows new players. I think he's actually he gets a lot of unfair press because of the Agatha Christie trial and obviously the tabloids going after him. He's got more GCSEs than most people. He's passed all his GCSEs with grade A to C. He's a very intelligent man because of his thick Liverpudlian Scouse accent and his background. That obviously in the media he comes across as a Neanderthal knuckle dragging thicko. He's a very intelligent man, tactically very astute as a manager. I think he's had a bit of a tough gig as manager with the Derby County situation. He's decided to go overseas. He's turned down the Everton job, and fair play to him. He's decided, look, I've got a good relationship with my former team in the MLS. It's a different style of football. I'm going to go over there. There's less pressure on me to perform as a manager. I can learn. It's like, okay, his win percentage isn't great, but his lose percentage isn't bad. He draws a lot more games. The team is not a great team, and that's down to ownership and general manager assembling that team to be competitive. That's not on Wayne Rooney. That's on ownership being willing to spend the money. But he's decided to go over to a foreign league to really hone his management. I think he did a pretty decent job at Derby with all the. If we take away the points deductions, they're not relegated. He did a pretty decent job at Derby with what he had. I think he even at one point was paying the players out of his own pocket because they were going unpaid, so he was basically making sure they were looked after, which is an admirable thing to do. The media don't report on that. But no, he is a flawed individual, but at the same time, he's a family man in the sense that he's got kids. He wants the best for them. He hasn't shoved them off in private school. He's sent them to the local state grammar school, wherever it is. He's as a player, his passion was not in doubt for both club and country. No doubt, no doubt on his passion as a player and his ability as a player. Fitness was his fitness and his body BMI was his downfall. Obviously his body type. But there is no doubt that he was fully committed as a player and was the English version of Roy Keane, in my opinion. He was a younger version of Paul Ince. That energy, that work rate, that demanding of standards of others around him, the demanding of standards. He was a Fergie type player. Unfortunately, his career peters out towards the end, but brilliant player. I think the media, the tabloid media, the mainstream media did a few hit pieces on him that were unfair. I think he does maybe a drink. I think I wouldn't be surprised if he does have an alcohol problem or likes to drink to excess occasionally. And I think he's had his flaws, but I don't think Wayne Rooney's a malicious person. I don't think he's a nasty person at all. But I don't mind Wayne Rooney. I was never a Wayne Rooney fan but I can appreciate what he brought to the game, to Manchester United, to Everton as well, and to England. I can really appreciate what he brought to the table as a player. And as a coach, I think he's underrated. I think he gets an unfair rap from the media because of the Derby County situation, and obviously him deciding to go to Major League Soccer to learn his trade in a foreign league where maybe there's less media speculation about him and less hit pieces in the media, and he can actually live a normal 9 to 5 kind of average life, which I think is what a lot of players aren't prepared for. Is I don't think they're fully prepared for stardom. They see all the glitz and glamour and the watches and the cars and the big mansions and the money, but then you get the media hit pieces into your private life and the just sleazy crap that journos go after, and I feel sorry for players now. I do. But this has been going on since the 60s, since George Best and Eusebio, for example. They were both womanising pissheads, and they're both now dead. Before they should be. They went on the old booze and womanising, and they both their careers suffered as a result. Maradona was another one. The hype around him got built up, not just following that hand God World Cup one, but the Spanish media, the Italian media, the American media, realised who this Maradona was, and they really he became a global. So people who don't follow football or soccer will know who Maradona is because of what happened at USA '94 and what happened at Mexico '86 and the drugs test failures in the '90s. They and because of his wild partying lifestyle, they know who Maradona is. People, a lot of Americans know who Pele is who don't even really follow football because you've got this marketable global superstar who's doing things at an age you shouldn't be doing. Like at 17, he's winning a World Cup final. You know, he's the first. I think he is the first player to play 4 World Cups, the first player to play 3 World Cup finals. Don't do that. Like, and this is at a time when the fitness and professionalism is at a lower level. The money isn't in the game, but it is now. And then things happen in the 70s and the 80s with the World Cup and with players like Cruyff and Kempes towards the end of his time, Pele in Mexico, 1970s, that moment. But the way the sports media changed from, Pathé Newsreel, here we are at the FA Cup final at Wembley in 1950. Oh, yes, he slotted that one away to colour TV and sending, live broadcast feed of the World Cup in '66 and 1970. Suddenly, these people become not just household names domestically in the countries they're playing in, like Beckenbauer in Germany and Gerd Müller in Germany, or Bobby Moore and Jeff Hurst in England, and Martin Peters. They suddenly become international superstars that people know about. And then you could market the handshake and the swapping of shirts in the World Cup in 1970 between possibly the best defender of all time and the best all-round player of all time in Bobby Moore and Pele. Two of the greatest captains in international football, two of the greatest players in international football. And then you got Franz Beckenbauer in the semi-final in 1970 playing on with a dislocated broken collarbone for 75 minutes. Midway, towards the end of the first half, he dislocates and breaks the collarbone. But I don't think substitutions were allowed in football at international level at that point. I think they might have been. But he's playing on with like a buggered, because I think they've used their substitute. If he goes off, they're down to 10 players. And he's playing on with his collarbone's just popping out all the time. It's broken. He's playing at altitude in heat. So it's about 35, 40 degrees Celsius. They're at altitude in was it Guadalajara or Mexico City at the Aztec? I think they're at Guadalajara. And it goes to extra time. It finishes 4-3 to Italy. Ultimately, that game knackers Italy, so they end up losing. And this is where now recovery, and we're talking about post-match recovery and strength of schedule. Yes, they did, and in the early '80s, one played with the Cosmos, and one played for was it the San Jose Earthquakes, and that's when you suddenly have these marketable players in the '70s and '80s. This is where the footballing superstar is born that we talk about today on a global scale. So this is where your Messi's, your Ronaldo, Cristiano Ronaldo's, your Beckham's, your Ibrahimovic's, your I'm trying to think of some players. Zidane's, some players of the night like Batistuta. This is where that global superstar comes from. The pre-Maradona era. We're talking when Pele and George Best go to America. I didn't. Did Eusebio go to America, or was he already retired? I can't remember. Bearing in mind, I'm younger than this generation. I'm only 33. I'm not 34 until the end of the year. So this is before I'm even alive. Let that sink in. I'm only in my mid-30s. I'm not in my mid-40s. But this is the time when Pele, what he does in 1970, and what Cruyff would do with the Dutch in '74, the total football. And his admission in '78, he actually boycotted in '78 from playing. Didn't stop the Dutch from making a second back-to-back World Cup final without him and still playing total football. And then you have Maradona. And it's not just the Argentinian media that's talking about Maradona at Boca Juniors. It's the global media, because European scouts are interested in Maradona. In the '78 World Cup, he was left outside because he was 17. He was seen as too young. When he's 21, he's selected to go to Spain. Right, Maradona's selected to go to Spain in '82 when he's 21 years old because he was 17. Um, and and he ummed and ahed about selection, and he didn't get selected. And of course, Kempes and Luque and Bertoni and all that steal the show. And it's a team performance in '78. Mario Kempes becomes that. And this is at a time when the South Americans, you had to have special circumstances to play in Europe in the '70s. Kempes was one of the few South American players playing in Europe at the time. This is at a time of political upheaval and a lot of right-wing military dictatorships in South America. The politics is a very toxic Cold War, and so very, very few South Americans were playing in Europe at the time. And then the early '80s happen, and then we start seeing the push, you know, anti-communist, the Cold War reignites. It's a little bit tense, and you have like potential nuclear war in the early '80s, and then players like Kempes go to Valencia, playing at Valencia, and then Maradona goes to Barcelona, and that's when the change starts to happen. And then it's in the early '90s when USA '94 is announced, and we get the rebranding of the Champions League from the European Cup to Champions League, and then we get Sky TV, and we get the more globalization of the sport and the big TV deals to the US. That things start to change. But USA qualify in 1990. They don't do very well in 1990, but they qualify, which helps them going into USA '94, so that they qualified in 1990. It's very important. And then suddenly, because the global game is in America, very important, that suddenly, and suddenly Cold War ends and democracy returns to South America. So all the dictatorships get overthrown in the '80s and the '90s. Cold War's ended, and left-wing prisoners released from prison. Pinochet's overthrown. The military junta in Uruguay and Paraguay and Argentina, and suddenly the South American players start playing in Europe, like Batistuta, Simeone, Ayala. That's just some of the Argentinians. Brazilians like Ronaldo, Rivaldo, Romario, Bebeto, Taffarel, Cafu playing for Roma. I mean, that was brilliant, absolutely. And then you get some of the Uruguayans going over, and then suddenly it changes. And now you look at the European leagues, and there's Brazilians everywhere, there's Argentinians everywhere, there's Uruguayans everywhere, there's Peruvians, there's Chileans, Paraguayans, and it's completely changed. Colombians, the whole landscape has changed in the space of like a 20-year period. In the '60s, none of the only South American player in the '50s and '60s to play in Europe was Di Stefano, and he ended up playing for Spain. He's an Argentinian. So look up Di Stefano, who played for Real Madrid. He was an Argentinian, played for Real Madrid, played for Argentina. He also played for Spain. Alfredo Di Stefano, the first global superstar, before Eusebio, before Pele, before Kempes, before Maradona, and all the other great South American players. Before oh God, before your Gigi Rivas, before your Beckenbauers, your Bobby Moores, your Jeff Hursts, before your Eusebios, Di Stefano was the player. And Sir Stanley Matthews was the other guy, the first Ballon d'Or winner was Sir Stanley Matthews. And Di Stefano was the first global superstar. Alfredo Di Stefano was the first, because he was the first South American to play in Europe. And again, you've got these game changes. You look at it now, I think the quality of play we're seeing in football now is less than what it was in the '90s and 2000s. because of the Ballon d'Or obsession with Ronaldo and Messi for so long, which has basically been a dick measuring competition and a fanboy competition. They're like, oh, they score the most goals. They're not the best all round players. They're not. They cannot defend. They're only good going forward. Except Messi, I think, is the better attacking player. But Ronaldo's played and done it at more clubs, so that's it. Now, the Saudi league doing what it's doing is doing what the USA did in the 70s and 80s that failed, and what China did in the 2000s and 2010s with their super league failed. They haven't got money. They haven't got any average. There's no fans in attendance. The TV deal doesn't exist. No one's going to watch it. So while they've got a public investment fund who owns 4 of the clubs, so there's match fixing allegations already happening. That's the problem. It's just Di Stefano. I mean, I know obviously about Di Stefano and obviously his time playing, and he's a very interesting character, very very interesting character. And this is at a time of real great political instability in South America with military coups and dictatorships and assassinations of political figures. And of course, Franco's in charge of Spain. Now, Franco is a nationalist. He's anti-communist. He's a staunch ally. He was a staunch ally of the Axis powers in regards to giving them material aid, so Italy and Germany, because they helped him win the Spanish Civil War. Franco's in charge of Spain. The monarchy is technically in exile. Democracy is non-existent, and the South Americans are staunchly divided between socialists, near enough communists, so we're talking proper socialists, and the military juntas, that dictatorships and presidents getting overthrown all the time. Di Stefano is an Argentinian. Now, Juan Perón, so Evita, that film with Eva Perón. Juan Perón is basically the dictator of Argentina at the time, and he's Peronism, very similar to fascism, very similar to nationalism in Spain. And Di Stefano ends up in Spain because reasons. And ultimately, he ends up one of the greatest players never to win the World Cup. Di Stefano is possibly the greatest player never to win the World Cup. Cruyff doesn't even come close to Alfredo Di Stefano. Doesn't even come close. Not even close. In my opinion, Cruyff doesn't even come close. People say Pele is the GOAT. Yes, that's on his club appearances and World Cup wins. But Di Stefano was the better player. There you go. Just put appearances and club and goals to appearances and league. Di Stefano is the better player. Di Stefano. Look, we know about the CIA and they are the dirty war and the Contras affair and what happened in Nicaragua and what happened in the dirty war in South America with Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, and what they did with dissidents, and the Falklands Island debacle where we got no support from the US because the dictatorship in Argentina was backed by Reagan's administration. Yes, I know all about that. The CIA, Cocaine Importers of America. Yeah, I know all about that. Yep, very much so. There was there was. I remember watching in 2006. They did a series of documentaries about the Football World Cup, and they get to Argentina in '78. Now, Vidala, I think was his name, was one of the military junta, and I forget the Argentinian player. And they had just played. They had just played someone in it was either France or Italy in the group stage. I think they had just beaten, or they had to play Peru. It was one of these games that was before the final, and he's just got into the shower, and he hears that the dictator is the part of the military junta, Vidala. He was the public face of the dictatorship, called Galtieri. He was the one with the mustache, basically. Galtieri was the one in the military uniform. He's the one who looks like a dodgy insurance salesman who may or may not be a closet homosexual. In the 70s, but very, very, 70s mustache. Anyway, he looked a bit like John Cleese. And he's in the shower and he got the soap and he lathered up his bollocks. So he's really scrubbing his knob and bollocks. Shakes his hand with all his sweaty ball sack on it, basically. because that's what a lot of the players felt about the dictatorship at the time as well, because a lot of the players knew people from the left wing, so trade unionists and socialists who were being murdered and imprisoned in the dirty war, the 10,000, 10,000 missing, the dirty war. The helicopter missions over the Rio Grande and the Mar del Plata, between Montevideo and Buenos Aires, you've got the estuary, and the helicopter, and they threw him out of helicopters and stuff, and disappeared him. And there's a very famous photograph of inside. They've just beaten Peru, and on that stupid scoreline, and he's got the bar of soap, and he's scrubbed his bits, and he's shaking his hand with his still. And then they interview a political prisoner who was being held in the Navy base in Buenos Aires by the big stadium, by one of the stadiums. I can't remember if it's the Bombonera or uh, River Plate Stadium or Boca Juniors, but one of the big stadiums or Neil's Young Boys. Anyway, and there's a big naval base that also has a military prison, and that's where a lot of political prisoners were being held. And they didn't even know that the World Cup had A, been bid for, B, been awarded to Argentina, and C, that they were hosting it in 1978. That's how long some of these people had been in prison. They didn't know what was going on. And they could hear all these cheers, and they thought, is that a public execution? Has something happened? Are we going to? They didn't know what was going on. Is there a riot? They thought it was a riot or a public execution or a revolution. They didn't have a clue what was going on. The stadium was 100 meters away from the naval base, and they're hearing all the cheers from the stadium, and they can hear all the noise, and they don't know what's going on. They just thought, has the military dictatorship really started to do gladiatorial? They didn't have a clue. All they could hear was this. They didn't know what naval base they were being held in, so they were grabbing in the middle of the night. So when we're talking about FIFA going to Qatar, FIFA went to Mexico in 1970 and 1986 when there was especially the 1970 there was a military dictatorship in Mexico in 1970. There were people getting disappeared in Mexico. This is 2 years after the Olympics went there. People were being rounded up and things were happening in Mexico. They were meant to go to Colombia, I believe, for one of the tournaments, and they ended up going elsewhere. I can't remember, was it USA that stepped in after Colombia was stripped? I cannot. Or was it a Copa America? Anyway, there were plans to go. I think no, it was Mexico in '86. They were going to go to Colombia, and obviously, the drug cartels and the civil war and the guerrilla insurgency and the people getting murdered. They ended up going to Mexico again, but they were going to go to Colombia. They'd been to Argentina, where there was a brutal military dictatorship murdering people at the time. Then they go to Spain in '82, not long after Franco's died. But they still were human rights abuses happening in Spain at the time. There was a military coup. There was an attempted overthrow of democracy. I think, was it 1980 or 1981? Not long before, there was a military attempted coup. Violent. There was violence. They've been to Russia. They've obviously been to Qatar. South Africa is apartheid still happened in my lifetime. There was still the apartheid policy until 1990, and then first free fair democratic elections happened in '94. The year I was born, apartheid was still a government policy in South Africa. Nelson Mandela is not released from prison, and the policy is not withdrawn until later in my lifetime. That's a Rugby World Cup, a Cricket World Cup, and a Football World Cup in South Africa. They got an atrocious human rights record. Atrocious. So when we're talking about FIFA and the Qatar thing, FIFA's already got blood in his hands anyway. People were more than happy for some of these countries to have these tournaments. They didn't bat an eyelid. So it's a bit rich for people now to go, oh, we're going to a horrible country like Russia or Qatar. They went to Argentina when the military dictatorship was murdering and arresting tens of thousands of their own people. And then also assisting other dictators in South America to murder their own people and imprison their own people in Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, they destabilised. They were part of a Southern Cone, as they called. Colombia. The World Cup was going to go to Colombia. They went to Mexico, and there was a military dictatorship. So let's not pretend FIFA have always been nice people. They've taken World Cup to places it shouldn't have been, and made a lot of money out of it. And yeah, I remember watching the documentary of all the World Cups up to 2002, and the 1978 documentary is stunning when they discuss the political prisoners and they talk to them, and some of them are still obviously alive today, and they interview them, and these people are like, well, we didn't realise that the football stadium where the World Cup final was being played, Holland, Germany, Holland, Argentina, was 100 metres from where, in the courtyard, prisoners were being executed or led away on and disappeared and never seen again. It was a thing. So when we're discussing Qatar last year and all the human rights abuses, Qatar World Cup has got nothing on the Argentina '78 World Cup. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And now we see what the Russians and the Ukrainians are doing to each other in Eastern Europe, and nothing. Qatar's got nothing on some of these World Cups and some of this stuff that went on. Absolutely nothing. It's hypocrisy at its finest. Was I happy that Qatar got the World Cup? No. I'll agree with that. But then you look at the IOC, and they've taken Olympics places like China, which has been committing human rights abuses for 60 years, 70 years plus. And they still committing them today. They did go to Russia for the Soviet Union in 1980. Was it Moscow? Yeah, 1980, and they went to Sochi in 2014. So some of these governing bodies and where they choose events to go, I mean, it's laughable. The hypocrisy from the media, because that dictatorship's our friend at the moment, so we can let that slide. But this dictatorship isn't our friend, or this one isn't our friend, so we're going to go after them. It's laughable. This is why sport should be a unifier, but it ends up becoming a political football. And so this is what look at the Commonwealth Games. No one wants to host the Commonwealth Games in 2026. Rugby League World Cup. No one's been announced as the host of that, but we know it's going to take place in 3 years' time, and we know it's going to be in the Southern Hemisphere. It's New Zealand, isn't it? And yeah, just professional sport and how professional sport and then Olympic and Commonwealth sport and World Championship sport, where the amateur but get government funding, starts to become a political football on what countries should and shouldn't host major sporting events. When professional sport gets caught up in politics, vice versa, it's a toxic mix. We've seen it in the last, I'm going to say 6 years, 7 years. I think Colin Kaepernick, is that moment where it's not an Olympic sport, but the Olympics for the athletes, the US athletes doing the Black Panther. No, this is Colin Kaepernick taking the knee. And that's, I can't remember, was it 2018, 2019, something like that? It's within the lifetime of the channel, and it's definitely divided opinion. And now there's the politicians, gaslighting people to get votes, and using Colin Kaepernick or the Premier League taking the knee, which the England players take the knee, which I find doing nothing but actually break it down. It's suddenly you realise what BLM is all about. And the founders of BLM made a lot of money out of people's donations and now live in multi-million-dollar mansions and have made a lot of money out of it. But you look at when the politicians basically gaslight the public to gain votes, pretending they care about the social causes it's popular to give them, and then they get sport involved, and then the social. It's all become a bit toxic. The debate's a bit toxic. And someone's left the front door of the building bloody wide open, so I'm going to have to get up in a minute and shut it. Before I cook my dinner, or do I order a pizza? I'm going to order pizza. I'm going to be lazy. I'm going to order pizza. I'm not going to cook. I can't be bothered to cook. It requires effort. I'm too tired. But yeah, talking about the US, yeah, the US has got to look at it itself, and its citizens have got to look at its government and going, we need change. Now, the US has got is co-hosting the next Football World Cup. It was meant to host the next Rugby League World Cup, but obviously now isn't. It's hosting Rugby Union World Cups. I believe there's a couple of Olympic bids in there as well, where they're bidding for a few Olympic games. The US has got a big responsibility in the next decade or so, as a sporting nation. And I'm not sure if the US is fully prepared for European and South American football fans when they're on the drink. I don't. I'm with the way the polarization of society has gone in the last 6, 7 years, maybe last decade. A lot's changed since '94. Obviously communism fell, and there was much rejoicing in Eastern Europe. So when the Bulgarians and Romanians do really well at the World Cup in '94, it's expression of freedom, really, isn't it? Communism's over, and we're allowed to express ourselves and have special visas to travel overseas, where in case we defect. I don't think the US is truly prepared for European and South American, not only fans, but also that ultra hooligan, firm kind of element. Oh yeah, no, it is. The highway system was signed into law in Eisenhower's time, or just after. Certain cities have massive issues with their public transit, their public utilities. Yeah, they're finding issues with a lot. Yeah, and they may have all these big shiny stadiums that I call big shiny penises, basically, or big shiny boobies, because they're the actual infrastructure of railways, highways, roads, general roads, public transit is shambolic, and everything's privatised apart from Amtrak. The freight rail operators are struggling to move things around the country. There's been a lot of strikes there, and there's a lot of union unrest there, which has caused the cost of living to go up because the trains ain't running. There's issues with airports. There's issues with the metro systems and the public transit systems in some locations, not all. Some cities are just out and out war zones where the crime rate is ridiculous, and it's not safe to go out in the daytime, let alone the night time. So you can actually buy a house in some cities for as little as average house price around £35,000 or $50,000, which by American standards is like dirt cheap. Like, you won't even need a mortgage for that if you're on a good salary. You can buy it outright. You can actually buy a house outright without a mortgage because the crime rate in some cities is so bad that no one wants to live there. The unemployment rate is so bad. The drug epidemic is so bad. No one wants to live there. Now, these sporting events that the US has got coming up is a great opportunity for the United States, especially, but also the Canadians and the Mexicans to really invest in their communities. And this is where sport has a positive impact upon communities. We always talk about sporting legacies after a major tournament or a major Olympics or a World Championship or a Commonwealth, and what the legacy is. And I think London is one of the few recent Olympic Games. Maybe Atlanta in '96, Salt Lake in 2002, and potentially Vancouver in 2010, where a lot of the facilities are still used by sports teams, by the community as a whole, by maybe universities or colleges have use that as training facilities, or whatever it may be. We talk about that Olympic sporting legacy. Athens, falling apart. Rio, falling apart. Sochi, well, that's just a vanity project for Putin, really, because he has a dacha, which is a holiday home in Sochi. So that's just some of these host cities and host countries of various major, their stadiums are crumbling and absolutely falling apart. And yeah, there is an issue with fentanyl. There is an issue with homelessness. And there is an issue with some cities being so violent in the US that hardworking people just want to leave. And house prices have tanked in some cities like California. The average house price is nearly $1 million in some places. It's unaffordable. But you go to places like Arkansas and you can get a house for $35,000 to $50,000 and don't need a mortgage. If you can work remotely, you get everything done by delivery. You don't have to leave your bloody house. Buy a house. But yeah, there are some cities that are in a terrible state, other cities that are doing really well. It's not. I think it's a generalisation. The upcoming Football World Cup they're co-hosting, and the upcoming Rugby World Cup that they will be hosting at some point, both men's and women's, is a great opportunity for the United States to make a lot of money, a lot of revenue, but also the investment they're going to have to put in for the infrastructure and job creation is going to have to benefit a lot of communities. Um, so, and this is why they got World Cup '94 was a professional league was going to be set up, which was the MLS, and B, we're coming out of the Cold War era where government spending suddenly dropped on a lot of things, including military expenditure. There was a lot of issues. There was a few recessions in the '90s as well, and that had an impact. The Asian financial crisis had a limited impact in the US, but there were other recessions as well in the early '90s. And at the end of the Reagan era, living standards had massively dropped. Well, not dropped, but there was unemployment had gone up. And so part of getting the Atlanta Olympics and the World Cup was to inject investment via sport into infrastructure, into communities, and create job creation. Now, unfortunately, some states, predominantly on the West Coast, so Oregon, Washington, and California, have got massive social issues. LA, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle have got major problems. Major problems. There are other cities in California that, especially the smaller cities and the more rural of it, are doing really well. You wouldn't know that there's a drug epidemic and a homelessness epidemic. It's quite nice to live here. There are some nice places to live on the West Coast. There are some absolute, however, diabolical situations. Now, this is where sport can be a positive. I know we're getting to a bit more political discussion, and I think that needs to go on the other channel. But this is where sport can do a positive. Now, for those people who are struggling with living in a camper van or living in a tent, but actually working, and there are a lot of them who are living in these tent cities actually have day jobs, and they're showering at hostels or at work or a work colleague's place, and they're literally living in the back of a camper van. But the US has always had this major issue with a transient population. Has had an issue like this forever. It's the way US society unfortunately is. They've had a massive homelessness problem for longer than we've been alive. Even predating the industrial era, the Gilded era. We're going back to the Wild West days. We are going back to the days of expansion in the 1840s onwards with the US when they go westwards. There's always been an issue with a transient population, and a lot of the people living in the tent cities actually work. They just can't afford a place to live because either they can't afford the mortgage repayments, they've had their house repossessed, they've got into medical debt, so they've had to sell everything to pay off their medical debt for either themselves or a relative, or they can't afford to rent because rents are too high. And their job isn't a job you can do remotely. Now, some of them can do a job remotely, which means they can go to a much cheaper city to live. They can go anywhere in the country, but unfortunately, places like California and Washington and Oregon and New York State and New Jersey, for example, and Florida are just ridiculously expensive to live, ridiculously. And there is an issue, especially post-pandemic, of a shortage of people in the construction industry. So if you are bidding for any major sporting event, you better get your bid in quite early and for definite, because cost overruns with sports events are a big thing. Look at Birmingham, for example. The Commonwealth Games was fantastic, but Birmingham City Council has now basically run out of money. And they're basically saying maybe we shouldn't have hosted the Commonwealth Games, which is a load of BS because they were already making financial blunders before the Commonwealth Games was even granted to them. So it's just a cheap excuse to basically deflect from the fact that they've mismanaged the council's finances, the city's finances for decades, and that they've got an equal pay lawsuit they've got to pay out, and an IT system that doesn't work. So for them to blame the Commonwealth Games who actually brought money to the city of Birmingham is laughable. But yeah, infrastructure spending when it comes to bidding for sporting events is a big thing. It does create jobs. It creates employment. It creates income coming in. But there is an issue with the construction industry right now, and a shortage of people in the construction industry. So that's why the house building shortage we've got. It's not just here. There's a crisis of not enough houses being built, not enough factories being built, infrastructure projects being behind schedule, getting overrun. So it's a thing. But no, it's really interesting questions that you can link into sports. So when we're talking about that the US will be hosting the next Pro, and there is this social issue. There are a lot of social issues in the US. Sport can be a positive tool to alleviate some of those problems, and bring employment to a city or a state, or a region. But at the same time, there's massive inequality. One of the most unequal societies in the Western world, in the democratic world, is the US. There's and the pandemic and the housing financial crash a decade earlier has definitely exposed a lot of fractures in society. No more so than in the US. But they're not the only nation with a lot of these societal problems. We are as well. You could argue Canada's got these issues. You could argue a lot of the European Union's got these problems. You could argue Australia and New Zealand have got these issues. You could argue a lot of countries in South America have these problems. And then I think what's happened over the last few years, and especially over the last decade and a half, has definitely highlighted the issues that are there. And yeah, it is a thing. And a lot of these governments are trying to use populist rhetoric alongside bidding for sporting events to back up their populist rhetoric to appeal to the average voter or potential voter in the street. Oh, we're going to back this bid for Euros or World Cup. We're going to back this bid for Olympics or Commonwealth. We're going to back this bid for this World Championship. So, because it appeals to the average man in the street who is a sports fan. Sport is our escape from our day-to-day humdrum existence. It's our escape. And the politicians have known about this since ancient Greece with the ancient Greek Olympics, and ancient Rome with Colosseum and the Circus Maximus and the horse racing, the chariot racing. The ancient cultures knew about keep the peasants busy and distracted while we mismanage the country to death and loot the resources and keep them down, but keep them distracted. But to the average fan in the street, the average sports fan, it's an escape for us. It's an escape from our everyday 9 to 5 grind, or in our case, early shifts because you're opposed to another bin man. But it's an escape from our everyday lives, our struggles. That 90 minutes of a football match, that 80 minutes of a rugby league or rugby union match, that hour of an ice hockey match, excluding the breaks in between, that 2-3 hours a day on a Saturday, or depending on the match you're going to being played, and you're in the arena, you're in the stadium, or you're watching on TV, that is our escape for a couple of hours. That's our escape. That's our escape from the issues we're facing on our day-to-day lives, where we're just, the bills to pay, shopping, that that is our escape. And the politicians have known this, right? And that's why they go, we're going to bid for an Olympics, we're going to bid for a World Championships, World Cup, Commonwealth Games, a European Championship, whatever it may be, a World Cup. We're going to bid for this because if we get it, it's going to keep people happy. People are going to be happy. We're going to be hosting. We're going to have all these people coming into the country. We're going to have all these sports on. We're going to, and it's true. Governments and dictators throughout history have used sport and entertainment to distract the population from their misdeeds. It's a great populist ploy to appeal to the average man in the street. And obviously, the UK and France are considering a bid for the IIHF Ice Hockey World Championships. I believe in 2027, 2028. So in about 4 or 5 years' time, they're in the process of co-hosting with a bid. The potential of the 2028 Euros, the potential of the 2030 World Cup football. Again, is a potential there that we may get the rights to host. We've already got all the stadium infrastructure in place. Transport infrastructure is a mess. The stadium infrastructure exists, so there's that. And obviously we've not long had the Olympics 11 years ago. We've had, in my lifetime, 3 Commonwealth Games in the UK, in Manchester, Glasgow, and Birmingham. We've had an Olympics. I think we've had some World Championship Athletics, or European Championship Athletics as well. We've had Euro 96. We had the final. We've had multiple finals of the Champions League, Europa League, and I think even the Cup winners a couple of times played in this country. So we've hosted a lot of major sporting events in my lifetime in the last 33 and a half years in this country. And a lot of them were very memorable for me. I remember watching them, and I felt very engaged. But the politicians use this as a way to engage with voters, going, well, look what we've achieved. We've backed this. We've pumped public money into this event. So, pumped your money, your taxpayer money into this event. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it made a lot. And so they do use it as we're hosting this or that. And then you've got to look at, does it make money? We've obviously had a couple of Rugby League World Cups. I think we've had 3 Rugby League World Cups that we've hosted in my lifetime in this country. We've hosted Rugby Union World Cup in this country. So we've hosted a lot of major international sport tournaments and events in my lifetime here. And we talk about the cost of bidding, the cost of hosting, and then do they turn a profit? Do they break even? Does the government get enough at the tax revenue to cover the operating, to cover the costs? Did the sport, with the money that the government's pumped in, did they get a return plus some out of that? And I think the Olympics did turn a slight profit in 2012. I think we made some money out of the Olympics in real and actual terms. Bearing in mind, bid was put in 2004. We got bidding rights 2005. And we had 7 years to build all the facilities, something like that. But it's like the rebuilding of Wembley took 7 years, and went over budget. 7 years to rebuild Wembley. Obviously, you can do it a lot quicker than that. But again, you look at the cost overruns for Wembley. You look at the cost overruns for White Hart Lane. And I think, when we're talking about, obviously, France with the Olympics next year and withdrawing from hosting the Rugby League World Cup, cost. They looked at what happened with delaying the Rugby League World Cup a year here. Did it make any money? No, it made a loss. Not every ticket was sold. A lot of empty seats. um, and it operated at a loss, didn't make any money. And then the French were like, ah, well, we've stepped in as a backup host after the US pulled out. We're not going to make any money. But it does say to me that rugby league could work in the US because they were willing to host a tournament, World Cup level, and that's interesting. That they were willing to do it initially, and then obviously there were concerns that they hadn't done a lot of costing. But I think, as I say, the way to grow rugby league internationally is through the NRL. Super League is starting up. Not everyone agrees with me with that one, but I think that's the only way that rugby league is going to grow. Internationally, is the NRL being the leaders in that area. In order to grow the sport, I would think the NRL has got to be the leader. The Super League has tried, and obviously COVID didn't help the Wolfpack and the Ottawa races, but the fans bought in Canada. The city of Toronto bought in. They definitely had a good following, but ultimately a transatlantic sports team playing in a league the other side of the Atlantic was never going to work, ever. You look at the major leagues in the US and Canada and some of the struggles they have with getting their scheduling right and getting, when teams play away, they've got to do an away trip of multiple games before going back home for a home stand. And so if rugby league is to work, I think they've got to look at how Major League Rugby and Rugby Union has done their model, and how that has worked for them. But then you look at the participation numbers for players. The US is one of the highest ranked for registered players who participate right now. Major League Rugby has had a positive impact on rugby union in the US for participation levels. It is ridiculous. They have really grown the player base. There are more people playing rugby union in the USA right now than in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand obviously has a much smaller population, but in New Zealand it's their national sport. In the US, it's only been professional since 2018. We'll let that sink in. They've only had a proper established league since 2018 at a top level, where they're professional week in, week out, they're training, getting paid. Let that sink in. They already have more registered players across the country at all levels, from youth level, university to grassroots clubs to the professional game of Major League Rugby, more registered players than South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. And we're talking, 3 out of the 4 World Cup winners historically. The US has got more registered players. Now, yes, the argument is going to be that the population of the US is bigger, so therefore, as a percentage of sporting population, that is much lower. This is true. And the fact that they have got more players than Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, well, yeah, the population is that much bigger. You combine the populations of those 3 countries, still less than the US population-wise, but then they do have more registered players when you combine them. So for 100,000 people, there are more registered rugby players in those countries. So therefore, you could argue there's more competition for places on club teams, more competition to play, and therefore technically more talent depth for percentage of population, because you've got less of an athletic pool to choose from. So there is that. But no, the fact that USA has more registered players is stunning. I was looking at the stats last night. Looking at the player registration stats, and it is ridiculous. So that says to me that rugby union is working. It says to me rugby league could work as well if marketed properly. If sold properly and they get the right international rights deal with the NRL and they broadcast the NRL games on a big network, there is no doubt in my mind they can grow the game on a similar level of participation as they've done with rugby union. There is no doubt in my mind. And rugby union is the slower, I would say, scrappier sport, less entertaining sport. I love it. But rugby league is faster, more brutal, and more simple. It's easier to understand and learn the game. I've always said to any North American who wants to get into either code, start with rugby league and then work your way to rugby union. You'll understand the game and both forms of rugby better. Start with league, progress to union. If you don't like union, you've got league to fall back on. If you want to play, if you want to watch, if you want to support, you can understand league. Watch about 5-6 games, you'll understand rugby league. That's my saying. If you can just watch 5-6 games in full, you will start to understand rugby league pretty quickly. Rugby union, it takes longer to understand everything that's going on. But the great thing is about both sports that the referee is fully mic'd up. So when there is an infringement and he's explaining the infringement, it starts to make sense. So for any North American out there, I would say to them, watch rugby league first, then go on to rugby union, because rugby league is easy to pick up. The pure basic skill is exactly the same. You pass backwards, kick forwards, and you tackle, and you recycle the ball. Basically, the best way to describe it. The game only stops when the ball becomes unplayable or there is an infringement, not when there's a tackle. So in theory, you could have multiple phases and the play doesn't stop. Now, rugby league, you could have set 6, kick, opposition catch it, set 6, kick, opposition catches it, set 6, kick, and ball might not go out of play for 20 minutes and there may not be a dropped ball. I've seen a handful of games where the play might have stopped maybe a couple of times for an offside penalty or a tackle or a ruck penalty. And apart from that, the ball hasn't gone out of play at all. There's been no tries scored because both sides are defending equally. And it literally is just a proper arm wrestle, but the game is going end to end. And it's entertaining. And there is no scoring, but it's entertaining. I've seen a couple of games like that. The rugby league is the ball can be in play without stoppage for longer than rugby union. We're talking. You might have. I think it was one game a couple of seasons ago where the Warriors had 10 consecutive sets without a whistle, and the opposition may have knocked the ball on. They picked the ball up and they make another set. They might have kicked early in the set, but the Warriors had 42 consecutive sets with 100% set completion or something. And they got 42 consecutive sets without dropping the ball before they had their first handling error. They won the game 18-0, that was it. So, yeah, the ball was in play pretty much for 65 minutes. I forget who they beat, but it's 65 minutes solid of not a single drop ball is ridiculous. How many repeat sets were in there is another thing, but yeah, I think I've got to do a video encouraging my advice for new viewers of both rugby league and rugby union and league. Watch rugby league first. And then get on to union. Union is a much tougher. It's not hard to understand what's going on, but I think instead of watching maybe say 5 or 6 games or weekends for the fixtures in the NRL, for example, you may want to watch 10, 12, 14, maybe actually play it a little bit as well. Rugby league, you don't have to play it to understand what's going on. With rugby union, I think it helps by playing to fully understand what's going on in the game when you're watching. Playing does have a massive benefit in understanding a lot of the intricate rules that rugby union has and the differences between union and league. Rugby union, you've got 15 starting players on a team, so you've got 30 players on the pitch at one time maximum if there's no yellow or red cards, whereas rugby league got 13 aside, which means it's 26 maximum players on the pitch at the same time without any sin binnings or send-offs. That's why, again, the rugby league is a little bit faster paced and more open and more stretched. There's more space on the field. There's two less players on each side on the field, so there's more space to work with defensively and in attack. So that's where it becomes a real chess match where there's a gap there. We've got an overlap pretty easily, and it's. I think rugby league's more brutal than rugby union, but there we go. Anyway, I'm going to call that there. I want to get some lunch into me, and then I'm going to have an early night because we had a thunderstorm last night, and it literally thunderstorm started from about 10:30 all the way through to 4 o'clock this morning. I've had about an hour and a half, 2 hours sleep before going to work, so I'm feeling a bit not at the races. I know I've waffled more than asked questions, but I think some of the questions were quite good, and we did link in social and political issues into sport, which I know I say I want to keep politics off the channel, but sometimes, especially when it comes to bidding for tournaments, bidding for Olympics, you need government support in order to do that, and government funding in order to fund the stadiums, fund the infrastructure. But no, it's been an interesting one. I think I haven't covered. One thing I want to say before I leave is the Everton potential takeover. I have concerns about the potential Everton takeover, and I will do a video on that when it is fully confirmed they are clear to take over the club and buy out Mashiri's 94% stake or 90% stake he has in the club. I think Ken Wright has about 10%. There's a big debate about what's happening with the ownership at Everton. Will that takeover fully go through as quickly as possible? Will they meet the criteria? But I have grave concerns about 777 Investments or Enterprise, whatever it is, because of venture capitalists. I fear for Everton going forward as a football club, and we'll keep an eye on that potential. It hasn't been confirmed it's definitely going ahead, but they've obviously said we're willing to take over, willing to pay the money, we're willing to buy this guy out. He's willing to sell to them. Obviously, Everton have got their financial fair play concerns. They've got the new stadium build ongoing. They're struggling in the league. A lot going on at Everton. There's been a lot of losses, a lot of money spent. And it's going to be interesting to see if this takeover goes through and if Everton stay up. If Everton get relegated this season, that's they're in serious trouble. So they're a club to keep an eye on. And of course, Eric Ten Hag and the situation at Manchester United with player unrest, I think, is there, and player culture that's there. That's something else to look at as well. So we'll see what happens with Anthony. With what's going on with him. David Sancho, whether he decides, I want to get out of here, or if he plays again, if they send him out on loan. Eric Ten Hag and Sean Dyche, will they be managing their clubs at the end of the season? That's another interesting one. Will one of them be one of the first managers sacked? Will Pochettino see out things at Chelsea because they're not playing well? Will Tottenham continue their good form deep into the season? Will they be competitive come the end of the season? Since Harry Kane's left, there's a lot of interesting things going on at the moment in clubland in football. Obviously, the Rugby Union World Cup, we've got a couple of days off, and then Wednesday, Italy play Uruguay. And again, that's going to be an interesting game. And then we've got, I think, some games in the daytime on Thursday and Friday, and then we've got some more games on the weekend. So this is where the scheduling of the World Cup comes into question. and we can discuss scheduling in the World Cup and how that's positively or negatively impacting things. But anyway, I'm going to call that a day. I want to really say a massive thank you to everyone who has obviously watched and left questions and engaged. I know I've waffled a little bit, but it was normally chat really. But no, some of the questions have been good. Obviously, some really interesting topics that we covered. And yeah, next time I mean, I should have done it maybe a little bit later in the day, but it's just engaging with you guys is more fun on the weekend. But with the Rugby World Cup and all that, the kickoff times, it's just I'll be doing live streams far too late into the evening, and times matches finishing the last game of the day. It's already 10, 11 o'clock my time, and I've got to be up at like 3 in the morning. So it's there's some days where I've been awake for like 21, 22 hours when I finally finish what I'm doing. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Really appreciate all the questions, and I'll have some more content for you guys very soon.